going live.
You are live.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Thursday, June 16th, 2022 special meeting of the Financial Advisory Commission, called for the sole purpose of consideration of 4 collective bargaining agreements between the city and 4 collective bargaining units. We have with us today commission members, me, Chair Fred Sussman, Vice Chair Bob Burden, Patrick Bannon, Jim Cardillo, Ed Meehan, and that's it. I have not heard from Terry Hepworth or our final member, Frank Brown.
Mr. Chair, Perry Hepworth is in the attendee list. I was just about to ask if you wanted me to bring him on.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Perry Hepworth is in the attendee list. Would you like me to bring him on?
Oh, yes, please.
Will do.
Good morning, Perry. We'll add Commission Member Perry Hepworth to those in attendance. And from city staff, we have, let's see, David Jarrell, City Manager for the next month and a half. David, I don't know, would say congratulations on the switch or wish you well, but good to have you.
Thank you.
Continuing with the city. Tricia Hopkins, Human Resources Manager, Kerry Berger from the Office of Law, Jody Dickinson, Finance Director, Kim Moronsky from the Finance Department, Madeline Horrell and Mark Hildebrand from the City of Annapolis TV. And I think that is everybody who are reflected on the screens. So just an opening comment, and as I said, we're here today to consider 4 collective bargaining agreements. This is pursuant to authority in the city code, which gives the Financial Advisory Commission the discretionary authority as may, as opposed to shall, I believe, review and consider collective bargaining agreements before they are executed. And 4 collective bargaining agreements have been presented to the City Council for approval by Resolution 31-22 and have been referred to the Financial Advisory Commission for any comments we choose to make. So that having been said, I believe that city staff is going to make presentations and help us understand what these agreements are all about. I have a couple of small issues with respect to a few of the agreements, but I'll hold those for the time being. I see Jim Cardillo has his hand raised, so Jim.
I move that we approve the agenda as provided.
I'm sorry, I skipped that. Motion made to approve the agenda as submitted. Second on that.
Second.
Bob Burden. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed? You have it. The agenda is proposed is approved, as I indicated, the sole item being consideration of the 4 collective bargaining agreements. So that having been said, let me turn it over to either David Jarrell or Jody Dickinson, or whoever from the city staff is going to make presentations and help us understand what these agreements are all about and what they reflect. So go ahead.
Okay, Fred. So I'll go ahead and get started. Then I'll turn it over to Jody and to Tricia and Carrie for more detailed information. So just by way of background, first, the staff report and fiscal impact note, which is a 10-page document that was included in your package, is sort of the executive summary for all the agreements. So that will be our main document that we're working through. So just by way of background, as you all know, the inflation rate is very high right now. It's somewhere between 7% and 8%. So that certainly added a different twist to these negotiations compared to what we anticipated about a year ago when we were talking about the need to have tight CBAs going forward. So we still endeavored to do that, but we had to address the fact that inflation is high right now. So I'll start first, just a real high level overview of the economic agreements that are in the agreements. And starting with police first, because that was certainly the one that had the most interest and the one that we needed to address some issues with police salaries. So police have had difficulties with retention and recruitment for a number of years and have been unable to fill all of the funded positions. The current salaries are much lower than market currently, so we felt the need to address those. So what we ended up agreeing to is to increase the whole table in order that the lowest starting pay, the P10 step 1 position, would be at $60,000. So that would be the base from which all of the other police salaries would go from. So we kept the same step and grade increases as the current table, but raised that lowest starting position up to 60,000. So then that trickled all the way up through the ranks. So we ended up also giving them a 2.5% COLA to get to that number. No one-time payment for the police. So we feel like getting to that 60,000 as a starting salary will improve the recruiting for the police department, and then having that trickle all the way through the table will help with retention as well. So we can talk more about police later, but that's kind of a high level of what our intention was and what we agreed to. Fire next, Iaff Local 1926. And by the way, police is UFCW Local 400. I'm sure you figured that out. So fire does not have the same recruitment and retention issues that police do. They are very successful in retaining firefighters and also in recruiting firefighters. They get a lot more applications than what they have positions to fill. But yet inflation still is affecting their salaries as well. So we ended up negotiating a 2.5% COLA for the next 2 years. Again, much lower than the 7 to 8% inflation that we have right now. We're also giving them one-time payments both years of $3,000 each year. We also have a small increase in their overall table. The F10 step 1 position is getting a $500 increase, again, compared to going up to 60,000, which I forget exactly what the dollar amount of that increase was. But anyway, in any case, $500 for F10 step 1, and then that trickles all the way up through the table as well, maintaining the step and grade increases. For AFSCME, no change in the overall table. Maintaining the step and grade increases, 2.5% COLA also for them, as well as a $3,000 one time. And that's for both AFSCME and for all of the non-represented employees. So 2.5% COLA, $3,000 one-time payment each of 2 years. All of these proposed agreements are 2-year agreements. We want to stay with 2 years because in 2 years we'll have the reassessments for the real estate for property tax purposes, and so those numbers will help inform the next series of collective bargaining agreements that will be negotiated. So 2-year agreements. The one other thing that I'll mention is that we added one city holiday. Juneteenth is now a national holiday. So that has been added to the list of holidays for all of the employees. So with that, I will, I guess, turn it over to Jody so she can talk about the fiscal impact of these changes to the salaries.
Before Jody goes on, anybody have any questions about the high-level overview that David presented? If not, we can always come back to it, but Bob?
Yeah, David, you had indicated that a significant point of discussion, if I understand correctly, during the negotiations with the 4 collective bargaining unions was the impact of inflation. Is that correct?
Correct.
And that point of concern somewhat drove the negotiations and the concessions that the city made relative to COLAs and step increases, as well as the one-time bonuses. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And the discussion was sort of twofold. One was the fact that the employees got COLAs the last few years when inflation was relatively low. And so they sort of got advance payment on the current inflation. The discussion was also that we don't expect the high inflation rate to remain for the 2-year agreement, that at some point it's going to come down and be closer to normal again. But it's certainly the current high inflation rate certainly drove the initial offers that we got from the unions, their initial requests for pay raises. So the starting point for the negotiations were relatively high requests from the unions that we then had to work our way down from.
The $3,000 bonuses, that $3,000 applies to every employee covered under that part of the agreement, irregardless of what their actual salary is. Is that correct? Those bonuses are not. Okay.
Yeah, so all city employees will get that except for police. We didn't negotiate one-time payments for police, but every other city employee will get that. And that's correct. That's a flat rate of $3,000. It's not a percentage of pay. It's just a flat $3,000.
I'll have more questions concerning that, Fred, later when you open it for questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jim, before I recognize you, David, I assume the council is aware about $3,000 payment to fire people. And the reason I'm asking that is because that, for some reason, is omitted from the staff report.
Yeah, they're aware of that. So when we just went through the budget process, we had placeholders for all of these, and we had placeholders that's part of the one-time reserve, both for this year's one-time payments as well as for next year. So we've reserved that from the one-time fund. So they're very aware of those numbers.
Okay, even though it's not in the staff report, it's not in the list of changes reflected in the staff report.
Yeah, it's included in the budget numbers, and it was reserved as part of the budget.
And we'll fix the staff report.
Okay, Bob, I'm sorry, Jim, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks.
We're playing musical squares there. Everybody's moving around.
Thank you. The cost of living adjustments are not, their fixed amounts are not tied to a particular published index or anything, correct?
I'm not sure your question exactly. It's 2.5%. So no, it's not tied. It's agreed to 2.5%. It's not tied to the CPI or anything else. It's 2.5
for
for
both
FY23 and again for FY24.
Okay, so it's not linked to whatever the CPI is a year from now for the second year.
It is not.
Okay, thank you.
Bob?
Yeah, David, just one additional question concerning the issue of police retention and recruitment. You indicated in your opening comments that a point of discussion during negotiations was the difficulty of recruitment and retention. And as such, there needed to be what ended up perception-wise to be a substantial increase. And the starting, or at least the lower level, going to 60,000, which bumped everybody up. which I imagine led to the 19% increase in pay. What benchmark did you use when determining the challenges for recruitment and retention? What type of data was consulted? What type of information was gathered to, validate that concern, which in turn, I would assume would serve as some form of rationale for making that concession?
Right, and I'll ask Ms. Hopkins to address that because she's did the market analysis for that.
So obviously this is a year of negotiation that a lot of jurisdictions were re-examining what they were paying. We were already behind significantly. One example is the county. The county had already made a huge adjustment to the entry-level pay that outpriced us considerably last time around. One of the impacts for us was we had negotiated under a 4-year agreement with the police to take a lesser cost of living increase over the life of that 4-year agreement than other employees in the city, mostly because we have provided cars to them. So the jurisdictions that we were comparing to, we typically use Anne Arundel County, Prince George's County, Howard County, as well as some major cities. Those cities are Gaithersburg, Rockville, and I think we also do Frederick. And so in looking at what those jurisdictions had and trying my best to get information from them about what their plans were for the coming year, it was clear that they were also pivoting their increases highest for their police departments. And so that's part of our market data that went into that. We also then looked at I used jurisdictions outside of that, knowing that our market could be larger based on where our people live. I found out that Kent County was providing their deputy sheriff $65,000. And we knew that a lot of what we do in terms of hiring is we do a combination of lateral hiring and entry-level hiring, and we were experiencing a much higher turnover rate. We probably had 15 vacancies that we had to fill this past year, which was an increasing number of positions to do for turnover, which is a cost to the city for replacement. There's a lot of overtime costs associated with running lower. The union put a lot of pressure on us because they had a lot of overtime issues they were bringing to the table in collective bargaining because, you got some burnout among officers, big issues around election of overtime. And so we took all of that into consideration in our offer.
Tricia, and looking at the retention problem, I would assume that when officers leave the city police force, they go through exit interviews.
They do.
Okay. And you compile those exit interviews?
So we keep that confidential. In order for people to provide feedback to us, we have to ensure a good exit interview process ensures a level of anonymity, but we provide kind of more of a gross overview of what that is. I feel that some of those most individuals that we talked to in the police department that were candid with us, many of them left a combination of reasons: increased fatigue around overtime assignments and just pursuing other job offers where that jurisdiction they could negotiate a higher pay. In some cases, what we had found is lateral officers that we hired were being offered higher pay from the jurisdiction that they left. That jurisdiction went through creative financing, so to speak, like they upgraded the positions that the individuals were able to return to. And so we lost individuals back to their original jurisdiction. So it's quite a combination of reasons, but in the bottom line, it was around our compensation in part.
Okay. And looking at the jurisdictions that you chose to draw comparisons with, was the only criteria proximity, or did you look at population?
So that was all chosen before. We had done a citywide classification compensation study. And we went through a process where we agreed on what were the comparative jurisdictions, both in terms of size and proximity, and would be a likely draw for our employees, assuming that our employees aren't going to move from their home, where would be a likely jurisdiction that others could go to. We don't examine where people go. We look at it more in terms of the status of the organization. So if we just did population, we wouldn't compare ourselves to counties. However, employees, because of where they live, could easily go to a public jurisdiction that is in fact a county.
Okay, because, some of the jurisdictions you selected when you start looking at travel distance, particularly in relocation of family, it would appear that you only looked at jurisdictions in the state of Maryland. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, you did not look at positions in DC or Virginia, or for that matter, on the Pennsylvania border or anything like that, which could be equal distance to some of the other places within Maryland that you were looking at.
It could, but again, when you get into comparisons with out-of-state jurisdictions, then it gets harder to use some markers that are in common. So Virginia, for example, is a right to work state. So you're not going to have the same kind of union overlays that you have here. DC government, because of its population and density and location, tends to compensate on a higher level. So that kind of skews your data that way as well. And really the Pennsylvania draw, that's more for firefighters, and firefighters, because of their 24/72, that where they live is less of an impact. And I'm very familiar with how Pennsylvania is set up. They're set up in a lot of townships. They're not really even designed the same way as our own fire service. So that doesn't make for a very good comparison.
Okay. Well, still, when we're talking about the issue of retention, it's up to the individual officer to decide where they want to go to get the pay that they want and the type of work environment that they seek. And quite frankly, an officer, if they choose to leave the Annapolis Police Department, is not restricted just to the state of Maryland. They can go across the border to DC, Virginia, they can go to Pennsylvania, they can go to Delaware. Some of these places are equal distance from those areas in Maryland. So I'm kind of wondering if in an effort to try to address the retention issue, that, whether this is really going to, be a solution, to the larger problem, if officers have the ability to be able to even move out of the state without too much difficulty to pursue the type of pay and work environment, that they feel is best for themselves and their family.
So
that's the reason I pursue that line of questioning there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, I'm still not so certain, that how this was approached and the questions that were asked and the assumptions that came from those questions to drive, the type of data that was sought, is really going to answer the larger long-term problem of retention if an officer can travel equal distance and get out of state and get a better deal.
So what we find, to answer some of that, in the exit interviewing process, what we find anecdotally is that sometimes people choose jurisdictions on the basis of how they're going to exercise their police powers. And what we find in fire service is that people will gravitate to organizations based on the activity level. Like if you really like to be an active firefighter, you might tend to go to DC or Baltimore because your chances of being involved in active firefighting is going to be there. So those individuals aren't even going to apply with the city of Annapolis. So some of what you're saying, I hear what you're saying, but it's not about leaving for that. It's about what you're first attracted to, what you pursue in your career in an organization. And, many of our hires over the years have been through lateral selection. So those are individuals that are coming to us from other jurisdictions. for a myriad of reasons. I find that most of that is not location. It tends to be more about the manner in which the fire service or the police service performs their duties in the context of a municipality.
Mhm. Just one final question for you, Tricia. And I understand the exit interviews are confidential in terms of the data collected being associated with a particular individual that's providing the answers, to those questions for the exit interview. Nonetheless, the data itself, if the source of the data is kept anonymous, could still be available for review beyond just HR. Is that correct? As long as it's not associated with any particular individual, given response.
So it's harder in a small jurisdiction to keep that anonymous because you kind of know who left. And if your numbers are in single digits or small numbers, it's easier then to figure out who that refers to. So we have not released that kind of information in the aggregate. We talk about it anecdotally so that we can be advantaged by it in our recruitment efforts or our
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Among those people that are negotiating on behalf of the city with the collective bargaining units, are they availed the opportunity to review that data when it comes to such an issue that seems to be a point of concern for the collective bargaining units?
For the units themselves, or are you talking about the management team's discussions?
I'm referring to representatives of the city
Representatives
that
of
are
the city.
sitting in the negotiations for the collective bargaining units. The unions raised the issue of retention and recruitment. Is the exit interview data available to those individuals representing the city when they go into those negotiations?
Not in the format of data, but again, the individuals that are sitting around the table include the acting captain who's in charge of recruitment. So he has a lot of inside information about their recruitment challenges and individuals that they, even beyond what we would know through an exit process, they have information on the entry process as well. And so that, along with the chief and the operations captain, we have a pretty robust group of people who are able to bring that information to the table when we are discussing collective bargaining outcomes.
Okay, so the actual negotiators. No, wait a minute, Fred. I'm sorry, because we're dealing with an issue that is of considerable concern to the unions who have data at their disposal and are negotiating at the table with that data. Yet I'm concerned as to whether the representatives of the city who take the lead in those negotiations have data that they've collected, from the city standpoint on these exit interviews to validate, the retention and recruitment concerns. And now I don't know if the captains are represented by the unions or not, or if they're not represented by the collective bargaining units, whether they have an obligation to the employer, in terms of sharing of that information or not. But nonetheless, the lead negotiators, and my question goes to whether the lead negotiators on behalf of the city have pertinent information to be able to effectively negotiate and represent the city's interests at the negotiating table. And the answer that I'm receiving so far, if I understand it correctly, is that they don't clearly have that actual data, that they have to rely upon the perceptions and the information that they get from, captains or whatever other people that are involved on the ground in this, and that's it. And that seems to me somewhat troubling and concerning. That's the reason I raised the issue.
And
If I
Bob,
might
I'm not
add,
sure that I heard. But let me just say, I'm not sure I heard the same thing as you perceive. What I heard was that, the individuals who are negotiating on behalf of the city have access to all of the information in one way or another. They may not actually see John Doe's exit interview form where he or she checked off why, they left the city, but they certainly have access to, whatever, information they might choose to receive regarding, the reason for departure, from the city employment. So is that a fair comment, Tricia?
Yes, the point I was trying to make is that the individuals who are sitting at the table are those that are very directly involved with managing the people that are coming in, both as an applicant and as an employee on the entry side, and they are responsible for managing those individuals during the course of their career. And so that if somebody is leaving the city for reasons that have to do with turnover, with overtime concerns, with our employment conditions, those are already known through the experiences of those individuals in the staff level. And again, anecdotally, we're able to provide confirmation or additional information that we have gotten through an exit process without it being about data itself. I don't know that data is going to provide a more compelling piece of this than the members of the bargaining team sitting at the table. I would like to also say that I feel that our relationship with our union members and the bargaining team on the union side is such that we had a lot of conversation about these concerns and issues, both from the representatives on the union side and from the management team. So it wasn't one-sided in any regard. It was a lot of interactive discussion that was spent mindfully during the course of negotiations to entertain and to consider over the course of our collective bargaining sessions.
Tricia, can you or David or somebody tell us who is on the city bargaining team? Not necessarily by name, but by position.
Sure. So we have first of all, for the management team, we have a labor attorney, Steve Silvestri from Jackson Lewis firm, who's been with us for our 4-year agreement and a prior agreement. And again, for this one. So he has some history with us. We have the chief, we have the deputy chief, we have the highest ranking civilian member of the chief's team, as well as 2 captains. The operational captain, as I mentioned, and the acting captain who oversees, among other things, the recruitment process. And Carrie Berger, David Gerald, Jody Dickinson, and myself were all members of that team. So it's pretty robust group of management representatives. On the police side, they have their labor representative from UFCW 400. They have the president of their union, they have the vice president of their union, and they have 3 other members on the collective bargaining team, as well as 2 additional members from UFCW Local 400, which is the union management itself, not members of the police force, but members of that particular organization. So I would say we probably have about a dozen people in the room.
Okay, thank you very much for that explanation.
Well, I just want to make a note, Fred, that I am perplexed and I respectfully disagree that data is not important when you come to an issue of concern during a collective bargaining negotiation agreement. And to me, I think this is a weakness. I think it's a weakness in the collective bargaining negotiation process that such data is not available to those individuals that are at the table and responsible for representing the city's interests. I'm not advocating that there's an adversarial relationship between the collective bargaining units in the city, but we also need to be tempered with the realization that each side is representing their interests hopefully in the best manner and way in which they can do so. And, certainly, the union negotiators, they do this as a living, day in and day out. The city, comes to the table once every 2 or 4 years, depending on the length of the collective bargaining agreement. Data is important, particularly with issues that rise to the level of concern that this retention and recruitment issue did. So I'll leave it at that. I think there's a significant weakness here in that process, and I'm just making note of it. Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to go to Jody now, talk to us about the fiscal impact and ramifications of the negotiated agreements.
Yeah, so I don't have anything to formally present. You have your staff report, and at the tail end of the staff report was the summary that I did that showed the financial impact of the provisions that we talked about. We had a placeholder in the budget in each fund, estimating what we thought the impact was going to be. Those impacts were determined for the major factors as the COLA and the one-time funds. Were determined based on a list of employees as of a certain date. And we also have any vacancies that were as of that date, we have them valued in there as well. So the backup for that is a list of positions and their respective levels and grades and steps and where they would be next year, and even to the point of prorating their increases based on their anniversary dates for their step increases. So it's a pretty detailed list that we use to accumulate those financial effects. Again, there's vacancies at that time. Some of those vacancies are filled. So there are some little differences, but for the most part, we've accounted for the positions. One of the reasons why management offered the one-time versus more money into the COLA. As you know, we didn't want to try to offer COLAs at a time when the revenue side is tight, but there's a great need right now. And the city has one-time reserves that we estimated at the end of this fiscal year, we're going to be in $6 million range. So having that accumulated from prior years, offering these one-time bonuses for the next 2 years sounded like we thought that was a good maneuver to provide some relief from the inflationary factors, but not commit to long-term COLAs. So we kept the COLAs at 2.5% for all, and all groups but police would get the $3,000. And I don't know if you want to talk about anything in specifically about the financial effects. If you notice on the summary that I provided, I've broken out the estimated fiscal impacts by fund and by total. And so that's available. So I'll entertain any questions if you want to go into some kind of specifics. And I hope all the connections work right, because as you can hear, there's a storm outside my window. So we're having some thunder and lightning down here.
Bob, before I go to you, I'd like to ask Jody just to clarify or repeat, because I may not have understood. Why was the focus on one-time $3,000 payments as opposed to perhaps additional COLAs?
Well, one, when you build the COLA into the salary scale, it continues forward. And as David Gerald indicated, this time last year, we were planning to go in with, if inflation were the same, we would have gone in with a zero COLA perspective for these unions. But because we didn't want to build in any more into the scales. But when inflation started to climb and we got these, the positions of the unions when they first presented was astronomical requests for cost of living increases. And we said, no, inflation is not going to, we hope inflation is not going to be this high for the next 2 years. And we don't want to lock ourselves into that high of a pay scale. So here we'll do 2.5 and the steps. And we have this reserve for one-time uses, and we'll use that to provide some extra relief for the employees against this inflation that they're facing now.
And Jody,
And as you, go ahead.
no, I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought you said it.
No. I was just, the reserve for one-time uses is one of our fund balance reserves. Every year as we finish the year and we calculate the general fund's results, we have the revenue over expense measurement. We have to take we take the revenues of the, we have to put 15% of the total revenues from general fund, parking fund, and transportation fund into a reserve. And then we take the rest of that difference, the rest of the excess, and we split it between our capital reserve fund, our budget stabilization fund, and our reserve for one-time uses. So based on that policy, in the last 3 years, at least, 19, 20, 21, we've accumulated a reserve for one-time uses of about what I project to be $6 million. So with that, that's what we started with when we saw we had this reserve. It has been building, and it is for these types of purposes, one-time uses. So that is what we're using to fund the $3,000 bonuses for those employees that are in the general fund.
Okay. Bob, I think you had your hand up first.
Yes, I just have a
Go
couple
ahead.
questions of clarification, Jody. And I'm looking at the, with the documents that we received, I'm looking at the staff report and physical note for resolution 3122. And I've gone all the way to the bottom of that, and I see a spreadsheet that is titled Approximate Physical Impact of Economic Provisions in the Union Contracts. So that's where I am with these questions of clarification. Just a minute, my screen went blank on me. Okay, here we go. And I'm down looking at the grand totals for year 1 and year 2, and I just want to be sure I understand what I'm seeing and what it means. I see at the year of N1, there is an impact of $5,617,913. And then I see at the end of year 2, there's a $5,716,983 physical impact. For a total of about $11.4 million over the 2 years that these collective bargaining agreements cover. Now, my question is that $11.3, $11.4 million fiscal impact, is that the level of concession that the city agreed to in the negotiations over and above what the previous collective bargaining agreements, the expense incurred by the previous collective bargaining agreements?
So
You understand what I'm saying? In other words,
I think so. I think so. So what you see there is, let's take the first number, year 1 scale shift. The police and this tiny fire, we made a tiny scale shift in the fire schedule. Those 2 scale shifts created a fiscal impact based on current pay scales. So the baseline is the current pay scale, if that's what you're asking. So that scale shift caused an extra $1.9 million in the first year. And then the COLA across the board created a cost of $1.6 million citywide.
I understand.
Then those increases also have an impact on the overtime cost because those rates feed into the overtime rate, et cetera, et cetera. And so the one-time bonus information you see below, that's an odd number. You'd think it's got the FICA, the employer FICA rolled into that too.
Okay, so in other words,
so the next year, of course, there's a compounding effect, and so this is the same thing. It's like the base impact over over, you take the year one impact and add the 2.5% on to those amounts. Hope I
Okay,
answered
so in
that
other
right.
words, we did add about $11.3 million in expenses to the city's operating budget with these collective bargaining agreements. Is that correct? Over the
yes.
2-year period of time.
So you say add, but yes.
Okay, yeah.
Well,
These
no.
agreements-
So I want to emphasize that you're including the scale shift created 2 million more in year 2, but that's not an additional 2 million from the year 1. So
No, yeah.
you're not going to be able to compound. It's if we were to start from this year and jump to year 2, we've created $5.7 million of expenses. You can't do it cumulatively. I'm sorry. No.
Okay, so in other words, what we're looking at is that at the end of year 2, the accumulated effect
Yes.
of the fiscal impact is $5.7 million.
Yes, extra expenses.
Okay, so the difference from year
Except
one.
for, I'm sorry. So there's a mix there because the one-time bonus is you're going to get them both years. So that is a double up. You would want to add those together. So it's not, some are not cumulative, some are.
Okay, so the one-time bonus, so in other words, you got $5.7 million, and we need to add to that 1.4 million.
Yeah,
at the end of year 2.
$6-7 million.
So you're at about $7.1 million.
Yeah,
That's not correct. That's already included in the 5.7. So I think this is a little bit misleading because, and maybe I'm wrong, Bob, but it appears that you're trying to determine what is the future recurring amount due to these new agreements. And the one time,
it's not just recurring. I'm talking about the outlay that the city has committed to in these collective bargaining agreements. And Jody is indicating to me that it's $7.1 million.
So Bob, let me think about this for a minute because I haven't thought about it from this perspective on how the numbers are calculated and whether or not it's a cumulative effect on the other elements or not. And you're gonna have to give me a minute on that. It's just all right.
Well, take your time, Jody. I think this is important because, it's important that we understand not only we as a fact, but if this question comes up in the city council meetings, this is going to have to be addressed. And I think that, this is a fiscal impact note, so I kind of want to know what the concession was that the city has agreed to in these collective bargaining agreements over the next 2 years.
Yeah, so it is a mix, but I'll have to go back and see how the numbers were accumulated to decide. Like the scale shift is not accumulative. It's causes, for instance, police salaries. It caused a 16% increase in the first year, but cumulative into the next year was 19%. So we jumped from a 16% impact to a 19% impact. So you cannot count that scale shift twice.
Okay, so right now, quite frankly, we really don't know what the number is at this point, do we? I'm just asking, do we know what the number is or not?
Well, you told me you were going to give me some time to think this through and look at it. So that's what I'm doing right now.
That's fine. That's all fair. And I do have a couple follow-up questions with that, but I don't know what we want. Fred, do you want to take the time right now to wait for Jody to run the numbers, or do we want to move on?
No, I think this is something I should accumulate for you and send it to you so that we don't hold up the meeting. That's my opinion.
Okay, and when do you think we may have those numbers then, Jody? I realize that you're away, you're not at your desk and stuff like that. So, and I know that we're pressed for time because the FAC needs to give an advisory opinion rather soon, if I understand correctly.
David, what's the timing on when we need to provide something.
So at the next council meeting, which is on June 27th, the city council is going to take up resolution 3522, so which is the resolution of the CBAs. So we would like to have your report by the 27th.
So Bob, back to you. You were asking Jody what when she'll have information available.
I recognize Jody has a lot on her plate, and I appreciate the pressures that she's dealing with. But nonetheless, this is a significant number, and I think all of us need to be aware of what that physical impact number is. And so whether Jody has to do it or whether she can staff it out, this is a number that not only do we need, but the Financial Advisory Commission and the City Council should have, as well, before we move to approve these, collective bargaining agreements.
I guess I'm not, you're saying that what I'm having a problem with is you're saying that we're adding $5 million in year one, but we're adding $11 million in year two.
No, I backed off of that, Jody. You corrected me.
No,
You
that's
said
what,
it's
so
not
that is not,
cumulative.
that's what I'm saying. That is not true. But when you look at the different elements, we will pay the 1.4 million in the bonus money twice. So, but you're not going to get $3 million in bonuses in year two. So basically they're not cumulative, but I want to check on that because thinking through this process and how I calculated the numbers, those I don't believe are cumulative.
Okay, well, the fiscal impact statement, and you've corrected my understanding on that. And I appreciate it very much. I now understand that year one, the 5.6 million, and year two, the 5.7 million, they're not cumulative. One's not added to the other. From what I understand initially is that at the end of year two, the total effect of year one and year two,
right?
From what I know at this point, will be 5.7 million plus 1.4, which is the one-time bonus at the end of year two.
All right, so that's, I'm sorry, I don't believe that if you're talking about what we're going to pay year over year, we're going to pay for these elements of the agreement will make the city pay an additional $5.6 million in year one. And 5.7, it's the COLA thing that's throwing me here because I'm thinking that you'll pay 1.6 and then you got to have 2.5% on top of that. So that I want to check those amounts. That's what I just want to be sure before I give you an answer.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I just want to get to a solid number of what, the commitment is that the city is making and granting these concessions to the collective bargaining unit. So we know how that impacts, the budget for the city over the next 2 years. That's really what I'm driving at. I think a couple follow-up questions I had, Joni, and perhaps you could answer that. When you were in the process of developing, not you, the city itself with your assistance was in the process of developing the FY 2023 budget. If I recall correctly, in an earlier meeting, you indicated that the city came up with an anticipated budgeted expense for what the outcome of the collective bargaining unit negotiations would yield. Is that correct?
Correct. That number for the general fund was $3,762,000.
Okay, so you estimated there would be about a $3 million
that was the amount of the placeholder. And
of the placeholder.
Yes, so during the amendment process, we went back and analyzed the final results of all union agreements, the final terms, because that placeholder was done near the beginning of the process. And we only want to quantify what we have put on the table or we know we're going to put on the table. We're not going to budget for the whole impact. So what happened during the final process is we calculated that that 3.7 million was not enough. So we added, we calculated an extra $1.383 million of costs. But in exchange, in order to fit that into the budget, we did two things. One, we added more turnover to police because police have told us that it's going to take them a while to fill and backfill all of these positions, and that their turnover over time is more than we had posted in the budget, and they could take some more turnover against their budget. So some of that difference of the 1.383 we posted in extra turnover to the police. The difference, we put more ARPA funding into the general fund budget to cover the difference. And that was an amendment to the budget during our amendment process last Monday.
Okay, so you anticipated 3.7 million. As you started going through the process, you realized you needed to add another.
That's your $5 million number there.
Okay, and then in going through the process, you understand that you needed to add another 1.383 million to the 3.7 million you already put in there. Okay, and that eventually the anticipation is that this total amount of the 3.7 plus 1.383 is going to total up to whatever the physical impact is going to be of the concessions that the city granted in the collective bargaining negotiations with the unions. Is that correct? Okay. At least for fiscal year 2023, correct?
Correct. And the 24 is there as well.
Well, you haven't done the FY 2024 budget yet. So, but you certainly will understand the collective bargaining agreements, providing they're approved by the city council as is, will give you insight as to what your commitment's going to be in 2024, correct? I would agree with that, at least in that area of salaries and benefits and so forth.
So yes, we know exactly what we're going to be giving in 2024.
Okay. Carrie, just real quickly, I had asked, last meeting that we had, and David and I have had some correspondence since then. The Financial Advisory Commission posed a concern in our letter that we sent to the City Council, concerning the appropriateness of implementing the collective bargaining agreements during a fiscal year in which the budget was priorly approved, in which the budget was approved prior to the collective bargaining agreements being approved. We have not yet received a response or an opinion from the Office of Law as to whether the city was in compliance with its code, which we did cite the section of code in our letter to the City Council. Could you provide some insight as to when we might be able to see that legal opinion from the Office of Law? And would that legal opinion be available before, the budget itself, I understand, has already been approved, but would that legal opinion be available before the collective bargaining agreements are brought before the City Council for final approval on the 27th?
So I can't speak to when you would receive a legal opinion. I was not aware that one was requested, and the city attorney, I'm assuming, is working on that legal opinion and is out of the office today. I will make sure that he knows that this came up. What I can tell you though is the issue or the question was brought up by members of the City Council to our office in a closed session, and we provided legal advice based on what those council members pulled from your letter, the Financial Advisory Commission's letter. So I can sort of give you a general view of the code provisions that was cited. It's not just that one code provision. There are several code provisions that come into play, and probably not surprisingly, because our code is not the greatest in some areas, those code provisions do conflict with one another. And it creates this ambiguity that gives the city council flexibility in what they want to do as it relates to ratifying the collective bargaining agreements. I will say the last round of collective bargaining, I don't believe that the contracts were ratified until sometime in July. So the city council has a practice of accepting the finalized MOUs and collective bargaining agreements after the first Monday in March, I believe, is the one of the code provisions that the Financial Advisory Commission, or the code provision that the Financial Advisory Commission brought up. But there is another section in the code that says, you know, to the extent that labor negotiations are ready for review, then they are included in the budget. So there's kind of that ambiguity there that has resulted in basically our office saying to the city council that we are happy to assist with cleaning up that code and making it very clear as to what the intent of the city council is, and working with the applicable departments, of course, the finance department, to reach a good period of time should the city council want to have a hard deadline on the submission of the collective bargaining agreements to the council as part of the budget.
Okay, Carrie, is a normal practice here. Well, I guess I can't say normal, but when you have areas of the city code that are in conflict with each other, and nonetheless, a decision needs to be made as to what supersedes the other. In this particular situation, did the section of the code that we cite, would that perhaps supersede, you know, whatever conflict may exist in other areas of the code or not? I mean, if this went before a judge in a court of law in a civil litigation, you know, obviously there are going to be arguments on both sides, but at the end of the day, if there's a conflict, that conflict needs to be resolved, and it can't wait until the city council decides to clean up, you know, the language in the code. So, you know, what's the criteria then for determining what part of the code would supersede and be the driving, you know, force here in determining what is the appropriate way, you know, to function?
So it's not necessarily looking at it from what part of the code supersedes another part of the code. That's when you look at the past practice of the city council and how they've interpreted that conflict in the past. And that's what you would look to when there's that conflict that's in the city code with the language being ambiguous. You look to the city council's actions and to make a determination as to what their sort of showed intent was behind those city code provisions.
Okay, we'll just leave it at that. I would welcome, though, the fact, having for the record a written opinion on this, because it was an issue of great concern to us. And if in fact the code needs to be cleaned up, you know, certainly, you know, the fact would welcome being made aware of that for future reference. Thank you, Carrie. I appreciate it.
I'll make sure the city attorney knows, and we will keep you guys in the loop.
Okay. Thank you. You know, Fred, again, I have other questions later on. I'll just wait until we get to that.
Fred, you're muted. We can't hear what you're saying.
Okay, thank you. All right. Bob, did you want to finish up with your questions, or do you want me to go to Jody?
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I had other questions. Actually, I do have another question that perhaps, you know, pertains, you know, to the fiscal impact here. And let me just.
I was going to just reiterate that it is not cumulative, that these agreements, if what you mean, these agreements are going to cost us 5.7 million in the first year and 5.9 million in the second year. If you're talking about over time, 2 years, you add them together to get the 11 million, but 5.7 million in the first year, 5.9 million in the second year. That's a grand total in year 2.
Wait a minute, Jody, I'm losing your numbers.
Okay, hold on just a second. Let me open. I can't look at both at the same time. Let me open it up and
Looks like 5.6 from the first.
I'm
and
sorry. Yeah, it could be
5.7.
5.6.
5.6 and 5.7.
Let me go. Let me scroll to the bottom here. Yeah, I'm sorry. 5.6 and 5.7. Yes, sorry.
No problem.
Okay, so what are you saying, Jody? Are
If
we-
you mean by cumulative, that we incur 5 million in one year and then we layer on another 5 million in the second year, that is not the way it's set up.
Okay,
These agreements cost us 5.6 million in one year, 5.7 million in the next year. That is a 2.5% increase. And the bonuses are flat.
okay, so we still need to get it a 2-year number though, right?
Yeah, no, you have a 2-year number. The
And
numbers
that
are
2-year number is what?
$5.7 million.
5.7 million is the fiscal impact over the
In
2
the
years.
second year, yes. And if you want to know what this agreement is going to cost the city in a cumulative 2 years,
Yes,
it's costing 5.6 million in the first year and then plus 5.7 in the second year. So that is $11 million. That's why I'm getting confused. What do you mean by cumulative? At first, I thought you were saying it was 5 million in one year and then it was going to be 10 million in the next year.
I never said that.
Okay, so that's what I thought. I was confused as to what you were asking. So it is 5.6 in one year, and in year two, we will spend 5.7 million.
Okay, so a total of 11.4 over 2 years.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
So
Now, just, and a point of clarification here, just so I can, when we look at, in past years and past budget cycles, when we look at what the dollar equivalent of 1 penny is in the property tax, I think we came to, it's what, a little over $600,000. Is that correct? In terms of revenue generation for the city?
that I'm not going to be able to answer. I calculated that for one of the council people recently, but I'm going to have to go back and look up my number. So
Yeah,
I
I
don't know
think
where
it's
you're
somewhat-
drawing that from, if it's from 4 years ago.
No, actually last year.
Okay, well, that's.
During our discussions, this question was asked, and again, I'm asking for clarification. My notes and my recollection show that a penny of the property tax is equivalent to generating about a little over 600,000 in revenue for the city.
That sounds close. I'm not going to give you a precise number unless I check it against what I calculated.
Okay, very good. Okay. And then the one other question I have here, and let's see, where do we go here? Give me just a minute here. Okay. In article, I'm looking at Article 38 of the Local 400. Paragraphs 38.3 and 38.4 appear to contain language having a yet to be determined physical impact on the city until June 30, 2023, because there's some type of committee that's being pulled together to look at potential additional, expenses that the city could incur if the conclusions or the findings of that, peer group, whatever, reported as such, and the city agreed to that. Is that a correct understanding of what's occurring in those two paragraphs? And again, this is under Local 400, the police. I guess that question probably be most appropriate for Tricia.
Can you cite I was gonna go look at it. Can you cite the section again, please?
It's Article 38, paragraphs 38.3 and 38.4.
Okay.
And this is under police, and I'll pull it up here. 38. 38. Here you are. I guess it's under miscellaneous. Okay, it says here in 38.3, promotional process, the parties shall form a focus group with representatives designated by the union and the employer command staff to discuss changes in the promotional process, including the language in the CBA and promotional GO, which was subject of proposals made by both sides in the bargaining. The focus group will conclude and present recommendations to the employer no later than June 23rd. And then 38.4, pay scale. The employer and union shall create a focus group to develop and propose changes to the structure and configuration of the current pay scale. The focus group will conclude and present recommendations to the employer and the union no later than June 30, 2023, which indicates to me that we have an open-end situation where the fiscal impact could potentially change on or after June 30, 2023, during the 2-year period of the collective bargaining.
I'll just say,
That's
just
correct
because
understanding?
anything that will be ready for presentation in June 2023 will be way too late to be in the budget for 2024, but I'll let Tricia comment on when we would put anything into effect.
So the point of these committees was to address, first of all, there was no anticipation of a fiscal impact for the promotional process. That was clearly only intended, that's an attachment to the bargaining unit agreement, addresses the promotional process, the manner in which we score and evaluate candidates and go through the process in terms of logistics and timing. And there's also language relative to appeals of any one of the elements of the process. So that's really what that was about. It was that we were not going to address all those concerns in the collective bargaining process. So we were going to basically put a couple of minds together to sit down and do that. The pay scale conversation was around the way the scale is constructed. Right now, the scale is constructed with 5.361% between steps and has longevity steps on the scale. So the idea there was, again, the construction of the scale. Again, it would impact us in terms of looking at the market and how other jurisdictions are compensating individuals when they get merit increases or longevity increases. And it was really about an economic analysis and determination as to whether a different scale construction would be appropriate. In some of those cases, it could save the city money, or could change the way we spend the increases for employees over the course of their career, both in terms of when you compensate them and how much you compensate them as they move through the scale itself. And so that's what that's about.
Okay, very
It's
good.
not, pardon me?
No, go right ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it was more of that we didn't have the ability to do the economics around that and to get what you want is a good working committee so that people are part of the process. So it's then easier to get something through. It's really a goal kind of citywide to look at the way our scales are constructed. And so to be able to get this into the police agreement is a good thing. Okay,
so again, coming back to the fiscal impact of these 2-year agreements, there is a component that is in the bargaining agreements that could create an opening for potential savings or potential additional expenses being incurred by the city, depending on how these pay scales are adjusted. Is that correct? By the way,
are you talking about within the 2 years or beyond the 2 years?
I'm talking about within the 2 years.
No, we don't anticipate that within the 2 years.
Nothing
No.
that would be at the point of rebuilding a scale would be up for negotiation until the following fiscal year, which is when the new agreement's going to be negotiate.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay,
You
yeah.
only
so in
got a
other
2 years
words,
agreement.
okay, so in other words, these two paragraphs pertain to something that may serve as a negotiating point for a subsequent collective bargaining agreement
Correct.
after 2024.
Correct. You need enough
Okay.
time to really do the good work around it. And
Okay, very good. Well, that's the clarification I was seeking then. Okay, and that, that gets right to the point. Whatever is in these two paragraphs does not pertain in any way to making any adjustments to the
that will
2 year.
have a fiscal impact. Correct.
That's correct. Okay, very good. That's good. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure. Sure.
That's very helpful, because that wasn't clear to me when I read through those two paragraphs.
Yeah.
That this would be pertaining to a subsequent, collective bargaining agreement after 2024.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because
Bob,
in kind of concert with that, if you have a study group that then makes recommendations, it's just a recommendation, right? It's not something that's ready for implementation.
I understand.
That's one step. The next step would be looking at the recommendations in a totally different light at the management level.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, sure. You're welcome.
That's very helpful.
Okay, Bob, any other questions before I move on to Jody?
No, go right ahead. I have other questions specific to each of the collective bargaining agreements, but they can wait until we get to that point. Thank you.
Okay, Jody, you have your hand up again?
No. I had my hand up earlier because I was going to clarify about the cumulative issue. I just took another look at the formulas that were behind it and confirmed that if you were going to add the 2 years together, the spend is 11 million, but it's 5.7 in 1 year, 5.6 in 1 year, 5.7 another. That's why I had my hand up earlier.
Okay, thank you. So that is still, Ed Meehan.
Hey, Fred, just a very quick practical question / observation. So it's about 9:18. We normally end around 9:30. I see that we've lost two of our fact members. Looks like, Jim and Perry dropped off a while back. I would say I have 10, maybe 15 minutes of questions that I wanted to get into, but I'm just wondering, as a practical matter, I can certainly stay past 9:30. I want to. I've got something at 10. I can try to move it, but I'm just wondering, as a practical matter, where you think we are in terms of the time we need to allocate, and if you think there's a concern now that we've lost Jim and Perry.
Well, okay, first, yes, I think it's a concern. We've lost two members, but we still do have a quorum. Based upon the discussion that I'm hearing today, and Bob says he still has some more questions, specific question, and you said you have some questions. I have one or two, and I want to hear, if Patrick has anything as we're going along. I don't think we're going to finish this discussion today, even though, at the end of the last meeting when we scheduled this, I said it's going to be a long meeting. I have no idea how long it's going to take, but it's obvious to me that we're not going to be at a point that we as a group can make any determination as to whether we even want to make a recommendation, much less what the recommendation might be today. So we're going to need to schedule a special meeting. The question is how much we want to push forward today and get through as much as we can, and that leaves the rest in terms of questions and discussion among the fact members, for the next meeting, or just, call it a day soon, with the understanding that the next meeting, there's not going to be any artificial cutoff time. It's going to go as long as it needs to go. So I am available to stay, or we can, whatever. Ed.
Yeah, it's all right. So, I mean, the reason I asked for the practical is I'm prepared to, commit whatever time it takes. If it takes the rest of the morning, so be it. But it would just mean I would need to take a very brief break at 10 o'clock and then come right back. So I can do that if that's what you want to do. But I just wanted to raise it, as a practical matter, since since I noticed Jim and Perry had
Well,
dropped
why
off.
don't we, yeah, why don't we look now before we proceed, for another, for a date for another special meeting? And we can all check our calendars. And if you all will bear with me while I go to my monitor and computer to check my calendar, get some dates that I'm available. I'll be back in maybe a minute or so.
Fred, if I may make a comment, I mean, it's just not our schedules. It's the schedules of the city manager, the finance director, the Office of Law, and Human Resources. I mean, you're correct. We all had the understanding that we'd go into this morning's meeting recognizing that this could be a long meeting. I want to be cognizant if we're going to, continue with another special meeting that we are asking for the time of the administration to accommodate us during a time when they have a whole lot of other things going on. And I certainly appreciate the support the administration gives to this commission, but I think that we need to be cognizant of the allotment of their time for, the work that we're attempting to do here. And I'm concerned that they came to this meeting with the same impression that they were going to be able to get our questions addressed and answered today so that we could deliver to them an opinion. And I do think the FAC needs to issue an opinion on these collective bargaining agreements. And the time is getting pretty darn close to where we're not going to be able to do it if we don't finish up. And also, we do recognize that there's one or two FAC members, I believe, that may be out of town next week, and unable to participate if we're going to try to get some agreement on issuing an advisory opinion.
Well, Bob, let me ask you this while I'm waiting for my other computer to boot up here. Do you have all the information that you think you need from Jody's responses to your questions, or does she still owe you or owe us collectively additional information that is going to foreclose us taking any position today?
Fred, I think whatever remaining questions I have, and certainly the questions that other FAC members may have, such as Ed and Patrick and the others, I think we need to have members of the administration that are knowledgeable and participating in the negotiation process available to us to be able to answer those questions so that we are properly informed, and we can give an informed opinion. I can't say that any questions I have remaining that Jody does not need to be present. She very well may need to be present, and she may want to be present to correct any, misunderstanding that I or other FAC members may have as we read through these agreements. I spent 6 hours going through these agreements, and I'm sure other FAC members, spend equal time, because we know we have a responsibility here. And I believe that we owe it to the administration to, be sure that they are confident that we understand, what are contained in these agreements, and that our assumptions and our take from them are correct, or at least not misplaced, because we don't know what may have occurred during the actual discussions that led to these concessions that were made. So that's kind of where I am at this.
If I may, I think all this means is, because I was asking just a practical question. I think all this means is we keep going.
That's fine with me.
Right, and I'll just need to take a very brief break at 10 o'clock, and that will work fine with me. And I don't know whether there's a way to contact Perry and Jim to see if they can reconnect or not, but we'll have to see how that goes.
Yeah. All right, I'm prepared to continue on. I've blocked out the whole morning, hoping that it wouldn't take all morning, but nevertheless, Jody.
I just want to make sure we check with Mark and Madeline and is it okay to continue? Sometimes they have scheduling issues.
I think we're okay on this end.
Yes, we are fine.
Okay. All right, we shall continue on. And thanks to staff for bearing with us, and certainly thanks to the commission members for taking responsibility seriously. So where were we? I think, Bob, I think we're back to you for specific questions.
Well, actually, let me go ahead and yield at this point to Ed, and Patrick, and yourself, and let you ask your questions, because some of your questions may very well answer mine. And I know that my questions certainly, seem to take up a larger portion at the beginning of the meeting. So let's give our other fact members the opportunity to be able to weigh in. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine. Ed, you said you have some specific questions.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So mindful of the time, but also mindful, something that's very important is, I wanted to begin with a very brief observation, which is, David and Tricia and Jody and, Carrie and Kim are living this every day, and they're obviously quite focused, knowledgeable, experienced. And there isn't the slightest doubt, at least in my mind, and I don't think anybody else doubts it, that they're doing, an absolute top-notch job. I view the role of the FAC as, in a sense, like a board of directors that we try to come together and help identify big picture issues and policy concerns and things of that nature. And we are, in fact, from a legal point of view and a practical point of view, one step short of a board of directors in that we have no decision-making authority. So what I think we try to do is to lay out thoughtful questions and issues that the staff then has to deal with, and sometimes the responses, and it certainly would not trouble me if this is the response to any of my questions or comments, is, well, actually, that's not a very thoughtful question, or that's not a very good idea. So I'm wide open to that. That's the preamble. But there were maybe a handful of points that I just wanted to make sure I was getting, and to try to lay out a couple of ideas for people's consideration. So if I could nail down just one thing, and I don't want to get us caught up on the math and everything again, but when Bob and Jody, when you were going back and forth on the 2-year, the costs, and I think I understood it. I think I'm still with you, but what I was wondering, Jody, you had said that initially you were ballparking 3.762. Was that ballpark intended to be for each of the 2 years in total? Because what I'm trying to do is figure out, where we kind of guesstimated and hoped we'd be, if you will, and then how does that roughly compare to where we believe we have ended up?
Yeah, so if you no, because what I was doing back in March when we were working on the negotiations, trying to estimate what we might need to put into the budget for FY23. We have to set the spending authority for 23 in this budget process. So the 3,762,000 that was the earmark in the general fund for the union negotiations was only for FY23. And like I said, it was based on, at the time, anything that we had put on the table. It was a calculation based on anything we had put on the table, plus things that we're about to put on the table. So that we knew that was what we were committed to. You don't want to beef up your number really high, because then the unions will see that big number, that big earmark, and then think you're going to throw a bunch of money at them. So you try to be conservative from that perspective. So I only put up what we had committed to, that we were committed to. So we knew that there was going to be a higher number, especially as we started talking about the police scale. So that was the difference. And what it did was, if you look at your 5.6 million number compared to my 3,762, that's the net difference. Now, there's some other things that played in there that added an impact, that like the training, there's an allocation for keeping their certification and stuff in there. Those things weren't considered at first, so that added to the number as well.
Okay, and I'm going to try to stay big picture. So then ballpark in year one of the 2 years, where we ended up, for, you know, all the very valid, thoughtful reasons, right, that people came to conclude needed to be addressed, is we ended up roughly 1.8 higher in that first year than we had sort of hoped to
I think
be.
it was 1,383,000 was the number I was working with. At the time we were doing the amendment, 1,383,000, and I'll have to see how that number was calculated. But that was the delta that I felt we needed to add to the budget. And so what we did was we added the 1,383,000, but in turn took off 500,000 from the police budget to add more turnover into their budget.
Okay, and then something similar for the second year.
So we haven't set the second year's budget yet. So if we project, like, for instance, the budget ordinance that we passed only authorizes the spending for the next year. This time next year, we'll be authorizing the spending for the following year. And I would assume those numbers would look like that year two. That the addition, if you were to quantify everything we've done in these union negotiations and the impact, you'd see the amount that you see in the year two summary at the bottom.
Okay.
But of course, and never mind, I'm getting too detailed, so I don't want to dig too much into the detail, because then
Yeah, no, and I'm sure that
it confuses everybody, and I'm talking from the perspective of an accountant. So, anyways, go ahead.
Well, sometimes the details are important, but, you know, I'm going to try to keep it a little higher level. But so the one other thing that I noticed, this is a little bit more of a detail, but it does relate to a bigger issue. So I have heard from prior discussions, and it certainly came through loud and clear, I think, today, that there's a lot of concern, particularly in the police area, in terms of both recruitment and retention. And I understand we're trying to do the best we can to compare ourselves to other jurisdictions and make judgments on what's appropriate to attract and retain. Very normal. One thing that I did notice was it looked as if for police and others, that there is a provision that eligibility for retiree medical benefits, that the age for that was dropping from the age of 50 to the age of 45, which, I'm not sure offhand what the fiscal impact of that would be. I assume there is an impact, but I was just wondering how it ties to the retention aspect of the goals. So what can you share? What was the thinking behind, we think, dropping from 50 to 45 for retiree medical eligibility ties to the retention concept?
So I can respond to that. Right now, there's nobody that's in that, even this 2-year agreement is not going to be impacting, because it's not until individuals that were hired on or after July 1st of 2012 that the age requirement comes in, because it was at that time we were bringing in the calculation rather than the city funding retiree health, who are in the non-VIVA, the OPEB benefit. Those individuals who were hired after July 1st of 2012 that were vested are in this middle part here. So those individuals have to get to a full service retirement, which generally takes a minimum of 20 years before the age requirement was going to come in anyway. So their request to drop the age is a future impact, not a current impact. And it's really not substantially impacting because it just means those individuals can choose to be a part of their retirement package. Those individuals that are in police or in fire with their 20-year vested benefit, it does become a recruitment concern because those individuals are comparing our benefits to other benefits in other jurisdictions. And since they could say you're a police officer that you have to be 21 when you complete the academy, you could be 41 when you reach your 20 years. In the fire department, you could be 38 because their minimum age is 18. So you are looking at a potential impact for some individuals who want that benefit. We try to hold tight on that because, I mean, we don't want people to leave. You know, you don't build your benefit plan for people to leave. You build your benefit plans and your pay plans and your other benefits that you have in your collective bargaining as an incentive to come and an incentive to stay for longer term. But that was a huge push that was there for, I think it's not for police and fire because of that age potential. That's not the same for, actually, I don't think it's both unions. So let me pull that back up. I think it was fire that was very insistent on that.
Yeah,
Because again, they have the younger age. We have age 55 for our general employees because those individuals are generally having to meet a 30-year retirement under the state plan. And now there's a different vesting requirement and an age requirement calculation that they introduced back in 2011. So you're not going to see individuals retiring under the OPEB plan who are part of the general scale ASME groups, for example, and non-represented employees, because those individuals have a higher age requirement, which is driven more by the years of service expectation.
Okay, yeah, and I think if I'm remembering what I saw in other materials and then tying it together, that's what raised the question in my mind.
Yeah.
I guess at least theoretically, as you say, somebody could come in at 21, have 20 years of service at 41, and if they stay for until they're 45, they could step out with a pension and medical.
Yeah, that's
right. So to my mind, and I don't know where the conclusion is, but if one of our real concerns with the police is retention, the more attractive or easy financially we make it for them to retire at younger ages, to me looks like we're setting up a conflict in the structure.
So, Ed, I will say that the calculation now on that benefit, so if somebody retires at 20 years, they're younger, they're at least 45 and they're in the fire service, those individuals are only going to see a calculation of a contribution of 50% from the city because it's 2.5%. So that helps as well in encouraging people to stay longer, because every year that you stay, you get an additional 2.5% calculation on your service to determine what your portion of the contribution is going to be to the health insurance, retiree health. And then of course, when you become 65, we no longer have a benefit plan for you that the city contributes to. We have a group plan, which helps bring down the costs as being a member of a group plan, but it's basically a Medicare wrap program. And we design that benefit in such a way, even though it's a full cost to the employee, the retiree rather, when they turn 65, we no longer are making a contribution to their insurance. So we have a gap period that we're helping to fund, not a full up until date of death or the surviving family members passing. So we do have some controls there. We do have some ways to encourage individuals to stay longer, including, the enhanced pension benefit, to do so, and that those that are members of the police and fire plan.
Okay, and this, I don't see any evidence of the following that I was just about to ask, but I just wanted to check is during the negotiations, was there any dialogue at all about the concept of trying to switch any of the pensions here from the defined benefit concept to more of a defined contribution concept? Was that at all, part of the dialogue?
So it was not brought up by either team. We knew that you had interest in that, so we have reached out to the state. The state had taken down their guidelines on how a member jurisdiction could withdraw. They've only recently, like this morning, replied to us. So we weren't in a position to have any real dialogue with the unions over that matter because of the lack of information.
Okay, and
it's
this one,
complicated.
no, and I know it is. That's why, for now, I just wanted, I presumed that there was not the opportunity to do that, but if I don't ask, I obviously I don't know. So that's why I figured I'd just double check. And I'm gonna raise another one, which I recognize is a major conceptual issue. And has there been any thought, or is there room for consideration that the idea of policing should be more regional rather than city-based? That there be some regionalization of the police with the county, for example. Is that something at all that is under consideration, or that maybe has been considered and been rejected?
So I can say not in the context of collective bargaining was that discussed. I don't know if
David,
the city manager, Gerald, would like to
I mean,
comment on that.
it's been tossed around as an idea in previous conversations, but he'd be able to give more of a background on what the thought process is on the police side.
I'm sorry, if you're waiting for me, I had to step out for a minute. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I can. Hey, David. I can just reframe it is, and I recognize this could be a very long, very separate discussion, and I don't mean to detour us there, but it just had occurred to me. I know some other jurisdictions have looked into and have made steps towards like a more regionalization of a police force, and so to what extent is that a concept that deserves inquiry, so that the city might consider some concept where, the city is sharing the cost of policing with the county, rather than the county has its own police force and the city has its own police force?
Yeah, and I can tell you that there's already a lot of mutual support agreements in place. So we get a lot of support from, example, the Capitol Police, from the county when needed, but both on the police side, but also on the fire side, especially fire, because they all dispatch from one central location. So they could send Naval Academy firefighters, they could send city, they could send county. So there's a lot of that already going on, but I think the council feels very strongly that we need to maintain the city police force, that we need to have control. Taking into account that there is mutual support all the way around, we support the county as well, but I think to keep a city police force is very important to the council, and they're the policy and decision makers in this case.
Okay, yeah, I get that. Let me step into the issue of the COLA and then the one-time payments that are occurring in each of the 2 years. So what was the support, the basis, for ending up with the COLA at 2.5% for each year? How did that particular number come about, as opposed to 1.5 or 4.5 or what have you?
So I think it's probably a back and forth on the negotiation side, what we originally offered and what so I'll let somebody else address that question.
Yeah, and I'll weigh in a little bit, and then Tricia can weigh in a little bit. It definitely was a back and forth. We started at zero. The union started with their request at a much higher, closer to what the inflation rate is. We really wanted to have a single COLA across the city for the sake of equity across all the employees. We arrived at 2.5, which, in light of 7 to 8% inflation, I think is a reasonable number, taking into account that we also are giving them, cash payments as well. But again, it was to try to get to a number that was supportable with the current inflation, but was somewhat consistent across the board. So Tricia, anything that you want to add to that? It's hard to explain the negotiation, process, and you understand that. I know.
Yeah, I mean, some of that is survey data as well, and trying to talk to colleagues who are involved in negotiations in other jurisdictions and where they were going. A lot of jurisdictions were looking at more significant bumps in pay for their public safety. And we knew that we had given some where other jurisdictions had not given maybe merits or cost of living increases during the really tough parts of the COVID years. So when you need to meet somewhere, all that information is absolutely critical. And that's why for us, looking at the inflation factor and addressing it more with one-time money with the bonus was our strategy. And then that way it doesn't drive the COLA up higher, except where we were in some real pay scale concerns with our police department. The bonus amount we thought was a really good way of leveling that out. Everybody has the same gas to buy, rent to pay, mortgage to pay, so our concern was that we were kind of leveling out a benefit across the bargaining unit members with that one-time money bonus. So that was a lot of the consideration in the way we approached this. And it helped a lot in trying to get away from a very high COLA request that was coming through from the starting point in negotiation with each of the unions.
Okay, and that the notion of going in here hoping to achieve zero on COLA, that was, if I followed the comments earlier, because we were accepting that there was an inflation rate, and what was causing us now to negotiate and agree to a COLA was that the inflation rate has basically spiked. So if inflation had remained at 3-4%, the city's position would have been zero COLA, but with the higher inflation, that's what prompted the need to get to where we are.
It was a huge driver. The other part of that was when you have money, it's really difficult. This is, again, sitting down with our labor attorney for police and fire. You can't go in with a zero-sum gain when you're sitting on a significant dollars. You have to be able to, because unions have the ability to be persuasive. And one of the requests that was on the table with, I think it was fire, was to go to binding arbitration, which we were able to handily reject. And so when you are in a collective bargaining situation, you've got many things happening at the same time, and you try to weed through what is just off the table, and you have to put something on the table to get things off the table. And so it's I hope I'm not being too vague in my description, but it is it's quite a process to get to a place where you're removing your non-economic language first, so you resolve language issues, and then they're always going to hold back certain elements so that they can get what they consider their most important. And you have such a process to go through to really identify, well, what are you not going to budge off of, so that we know what we're going to end up in our final hours getting to agreement on. And
Yeah, no,
so,
and I follow you about the process, so there's no problem
Yeah.
with that. But when,
okay.
Tricia, when you're saying, when, I think you said something like, when you're sitting on some money, what are you getting at there?
What I mean is that if the city has a financial balance, if you have, and I'll let Jody speak more to that, but when you are able to determine what is recurring financial sources from your one-time sources, you need to be able to articulate how you're going to spend that and the manner in which you're going to use that money.
So if I, and
But
I
it's
don't mean
there.
to, yeah, and I don't mean to step in front of Jody, but if, what you're getting at is that everybody knows we have the ARPA money, and the unions were coming at it with, well, you can afford to give us
So
more
it-
because you can tap into that.
But it's not just ARPA money, it's your income sources across the board, your revenue projections, your real estate valuations and returns through taxable income. All of that has to be provided, and we do transparency with the union. We put those reports before them. We make sure that they have the city's financial reporting information, and that's what you do. You start from a sharing of information standpoint, and then you go forth from there.
Okay. And is it accurate that the if you put together the costs, the additional costs that we are prepared to commit to, or that the city has negotiated, that the difference is going to come from the ARPA money?
So I think it's time for me to go through a little bit of explanation. So generally, yes, but we look at recurring revenues, what the city has in recurring revenues, taxes, permit fees, those types of things, and recurring expenses. And when you have a COLA and you have a step, you build that into the salary base. So that is a recurring expense. It's going to happen every year, whether it's within these 2 years of the agreement or not. In year 3, it's going to build into the next salary and benefit package. So those are recurring. And when we look at those two together, recurring revenues, recurring expenses, there's a gap. That is what we're using the ARPA funds for. All right. So with the projections that we have right now, we will need to use ARPA funds. It's going to be about let's see if I can do this in my head. 1.5 plus 838. So 2.3-ish. So that's the ARPA that we're going to allocate to the budget next year in 23. And then again, in 24, the recurring expenses keep going up and the recurring revenues going up. There's a gap there, which we intend to use the ARPA funds for. The one-time bonuses, we're going to pay out of that reserve that we have, accumulated fund excesses from previous years because of, we had more revenues than we anticipated and we spent less than we anticipated. We built up these reserves. We're using one of those reserves to pay those, and they're not committed beyond year 2, year 3. That number starts at 0. So, I mean, that promise for any kind of bonus is not there. So it's not building into anything future. So we try to, so that, if that's what you're asking about the ARPA funds, the ARPA is filling that gap between recurring revenues and recurring expenses. And so at the end of those 2 years, there's going to be a gap, and which is one of the issues that we've discussed overall for our budget. What we do in 2 years, do we increase the tax rate? Do we cut expenses? Do we find another revenue source, et cetera?
Right. Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm tracking you on all of that. And so to step back for a second, is on the COLA. what was the inflation rate that we were using when we were going in with the desire to keep COLA at 0? You remember what that number was?
I think at that time it was closer to 6 or 7. I think it's climbed a little bit since then. The negotiations went on from January up through just a month ago. So it was a long period of time. But that's one reason why we went in with 0 COLA, but we offered these one-time payments instead. That
Okay.
was our initial offer. We
Oh,
don't
okay.
give COLAs, we just want to give this one-time bonus.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So we went in with the one-time bonus. Okay. And then what's the current inflation rate that we're sort of tracking this to now?
So when you're tracking it to, I think the most recent one I heard was 8, a little over 8,
Okay.
but right now.
Okay.
I
Yeah. And I
haven't
mean,
read the newspapers
right.
today, so I don't know for sure,
Right.
but it's somewhere north of 8.
Yeah, that's consistent with, 7.9 is what I'm hearing, but we'll see. But so for thoughts of comparison and trying to figure out, goals and results and lessons learned for the future and all of that. So if I'm looking at it as 2.5% on the COLA, and then the one time, very rough math, is maybe 2%, but it's only for each of the 2 years. It doesn't build into the base. If we were
I think
thinking,
the one time was closer to 3%.
okay, all right, then, all right, so it's more than I had thought, but if I add them together, then it looks to me like if we were assuming at, say, 6% inflation rate, we were giving no COLA, but it sounds like we were planning on giving a one-time bonus as an offer. And I'm not trying to tie it down to the exact numbers, because I don't think that's the purpose of this exercise, but I'm looking at it as if at 6 we figured 0, but the 0 wasn't really 0. We were going to give you 2% or 3% in the form of one-time payments. Then we put the COLA on top. That looks to me like we're not trying to hit an inflation rate, but we're above it. And if I haven't lost you, what I'm doing is, if 6 means 0 and a one-time payment is 3%, well, then from what we understand of the inflation rate, we're ahead of it. And then we put 2.5% of a COLA on top. We're now 6 plus 3 plus 2.5. We're at 11.5. And I know this is very rough math, and that's so what I'm trying to get at is that with all the back and the forth with the one times and the COLAs, by having flexibility on each, it looks to me as if the unions got better than the inflation rate. And I'm starting to preach now, but only because I know I got to leave in a second for just a few minutes. But then it's also a question of, to what extent do we really think national inflation rates apply to the city of Annapolis, and particularly to these sort of wage rate and salary levels? To what extent are they going to be impacted? And is there anything on a local level that is more available to us to figure out how inflation really impacts cost of living in the city of Annapolis versus the city of Baltimore versus, the city of Frederick and things of that nature? So I'm going to leave that alone just because I got to step, but maybe I will, if it's okay, Fred, when I come back, maybe have 1 or 2 follow-ups, but the bottom line question I guess I wanted to raise is based upon where we set out, what we felt we needed to give on, and now we're tapping deeper into the ARPA funds, but we also know we have some costs in our base. It does sound like in 2024 that we are going to have to do, Jody, what I think you summed up, raise taxes or cut expenses in 2025.
Mhm.
Okay. And any crystal ball gazing on and where we're going to be, in making that choice?
I mean, one important thing to keep in mind, Ed, is that, property valuations are increasing pretty significantly. We don't know what they're going to do in 2 years when the new appraisals are done.
Right.
But there's some thought that there will be some help in that area. I think it's also very instructive because we talk a lot about the budget deficit, a structural deficit. If you look at our actuals over the last 5 years, we've consistently, and this is because we budget in a very conservative way, but we've consistently achieved higher levels of revenue and lower levels of expenses than what we're budgeted. So this year is a perfect example, right? We said that we were going to need $3 million of ARPA money this year to bridge the budget deficit. And in fact, we're not going to have to touch ARPA at all. And in fact, we're going to have a surplus because revenues are better, because we budget conservatively. Expenses are lower than budgeted and revenues are higher than budgeted. And again, if you look over the last 5 years at the CAFRs or ACFRs or whatever they're called now, this is a consistent trend. Okay, so we're we are concerned about the budget deficit, but we know realistically that the numbers that we have are very conservative, and we think we're going to outperform those, and we have consistently.
Okay.
And our revenues grow each year based on the nature of the property tax assessed valuation. The 3-year reassessment is phased in over 3 years. So we know there's growth built in there. It's just a matter of what that is compared to what we've built into the salary base. And to your other questions, we didn't start with hey, we're trying to match an inflation rate. We're just saying, here's what we think we can afford to do. We don't want to give a COLA. We don't want to build in anything to the base, but we can give you what was roughly equivalent to an additional 3% bonus, which compared to the time that might have been comparing to a 5 or 6% inflation rate. That's grown over time, and during our negotiations was growing over time. So we were continually, when that discussion would come up, they'd keep bringing up how it's climbing. And keep in mind, it's not for certain employees, the $3,000 is not a 3%. It's if you make less money, you're getting a little bit higher. If you're making more money, you're getting a lower. That's a lower percent of your salary. So, but we decided to do it dollar amounts across the board for everybody.
Right. That makes sense. And again, I'm looking at just sort of like the overall impact. So I apologize. I'm gonna have to step off for just a few minutes. I will have this on in the background, and I'll come back. I may have a couple of other questions, but I can definitely get out of the way at this point and then come back in for the broader dialogue a little bit later. So thanks for the time. I apologize, and I will be back shortly.
You're muted, Fred.
Sorry about that. Patrick, do you have any questions you'd like to pose at this point before I move to somebody else? You're muted, Patrick. Wait, you're muted.
Yeah.
There you go.
That was very interesting on the budgeting part, but I'm going back to the retention issues. It seems the city could summarize maybe in some kind of generic way without exposing an individual. I don't know, you could have little boxes, salary, cost of living, schools. I don't know, are they missing an opportunity to develop some kind of baseline for reasons for leaving?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Patrick.
They were saying there's some retention issues and they conduct these exit interviews, but some of that information may or may not be shared when they're doing the negotiations. So what I'm saying, is there some way of tracking these in some kind of generic way that would add value, such that they're leaving because of salaries or the cost of living or schools, or they don't like their supervisor or something? I don't know. Would that help? That was I think Bob brought that up in their negotiations. If that's information was available to the people that were negotiating. Nobody's following?
Let me pose that back to Tricia. If she doesn't feel she's the one, she can,
Yeah,
Carrie?
I'm sorry, before
Right,
Tricia goes into it, because I do want to clarify something, because what Tricia was speaking to was the HR process with the exit interviews, where they maintain confidentiality in those exit interviews. But it's also important to note that the police chief also has informal exit interviews with officers that end up leaving employment. And the administrative captain not only knows about the recruitment issues that arise, but he's also made aware of the reasons for officers leaving. So there isn't some sort of lack of information that's being shared amongst the management team. With the amount of police officers that have left in the last year, let's say, I think the management team has been made well aware of their reasons for leaving. It's just what Tricia was speaking to was that, more substance of the conversations that they have with HR is what's not necessarily shared. But everyone on the management team had a good idea of most, if not all, of the reasons for the officers leaving, and that the officers shared with either the chief, the administrative captain, and or Tricia. It is a small department, so people tend to know a lot about everyone else. So there wasn't sort of at least from my vantage point, I can't speak on behalf of everyone else on the management team, but I never questioned having enough information to know that there was a recruitment and retention issue. There was plenty of information that was shared amongst the management team. Whether that information is shared outside the management team, of course, is not always going to be divulged, but I think we were working with plenty of information.
All right, I was just getting out if you need to formalize it a little better in some kind of database that would be generic without affecting any HR issues.
we can certainly discuss that. I would work closely with the Office of Law to make sure that information that we gather is not in the area that affects an individual's need or appropriate expectation of confidentiality for the reasons that they're leaving. So if somebody has an employment issue that enters into an arena that would otherwise be protected, like they're leaving for health-related reasons, or they're leaving for workplace concerns that are not, they don't feel comfortable divulging. We have a lot of situations where individuals, because they have confidentiality, will share information because they know it's not going to be passed on.
Right.
Yeah, I see your hand up, Bob. I want to give Patrick a chance to finish his questions.
No, that's it. That's it, Fred.
Okay, thank you, Patrick.
Yeah.
Bob?
Yeah, just to follow up quickly on Patrick's question, and Tricia, your response, and I think that you went to the heart of the matter. What a departing police officer may say to their captain or chief, who's a direct supervisor, may be couched in terms that would not be as frank as what they may convey to an HR individual who is not in the line of supervision for whatever reasons. And there perhaps may be more candid responses that are provided to an HR exit interview than to a direct supervisor who has them sit down in their office across from their desk and has a discussion. So, I think that is something that cannot be ignored when you're looking at the data and compiling the data. And that's the reason, that's certainly one additional reason I raised the issue, and I appreciate Patrick bringing that up as well. I guess other than that, Fred, I don't know if you have any other questions. There were some questions that did, come to my mind as a result of Ed's, conversations here, but I want to yield and defer to you for whatever you have as well.
I just have two or three, in the grand scheme, I think relatively minor questions. A lot of my questions and concerns have been addressed already through you, Bob, through Ed. But with respect to the police contract, it looks like Article 34 dealing with tuition reimbursement is obsolete because that program has already ended. I'm wondering why that has not been proposed for removal from the agreement.
So it is often the case where if it's a funding concern, they don't want the language removed from there. Should you come back with, and it's a placeholder, right? So if you come back and you say that in a future year, you're going to fund it, you identify it specifically as funding. Otherwise, if you removed it entirely, you would have to renumber the entire section. That's part of it. That's certainly not the most compelling reason. But oftentimes what you get agreement on is that they'll accept the fact that you're not funding it this year, but they don't want the language removed.
With respect to the two AFSCME agreements, one. In paragraph 26.1 of one and 27.1 of the other, they identify the agreements as two-year agreements, but with a continuation provision that in the event that another agreement is not entered into, ratified prior to the expiration of these agreements, then they will continue in force and effect. In real world, how does that play out? Because a lot of these provisions in these agreements are two-year provisions. They're funding provisions for 2 years. There are some other provisions for 2 years, and the agreements themselves are for 2 years. So what portions or parts of the agreement, will continue on if there is no ratified agreement at the end of 2024 or June 30th, 2024?
So because you have specific language in there about the $3,000 and the manner in which you're going to provide that, that would not continue into a subsequent year. What it allows for is that the FY24 pay scale, because that's, this is expiring at the end of fiscal year 24, it allows that pay scale to be in place so that you continue to pay individuals in accordance with that scale.
That's all I have.
And other terms as well, right, Tricia?
Well,
Some
your
of the other-
overtime provisions, your holiday pay.
Yeah, like the payments for their certification, maintaining their certifications, that kind of thing.
Right.
Continue.
Okay, that's all I have for right now. As I said, a lot of my questions and concerns, were addressed through earlier discussion and dialogue.
Okay.
Bob, let me turn it back to you.
Yeah, just to follow up on a couple of issues that Ed raised, and when he was talking about the rationale for the COLAs at 2.5%, and David, I'm going to ask for clarification of what you said here so that my understanding, is clear or accurate. But I believe your comment said that one of the reasons that you went for the 2.5% was the city or the negotiators at the table, city negotiators, were seeking equity across all employees. And so that kind of raised a question in my mind that were we attempting to seek equity across all employees, even if it meant increasing the expense to the city, for seeking that equity, even if that expense could potentially be mitigated otherwise?
No, not at all. No.
Okay, could you please elaborate then? I don't quite understand what you meant by
We
seeking
weren't seeking
equity.
to have equal numbers. What we were seeking is, so the membership for each of these organizations have to approve the agreement. And so by having a consistent 2.5% for each helps that process, but we were not seeking to artificially raise any of them. I mean, clearly with inflation the way it is now, this is well below the rate that most of the unions thought they would be able to get from this negotiation. And so by having some consistency across all of the various unions helps with that process of getting the union members to sign up to it. But there was no thought at all of artificially raising any of the wages in order to get to 2.5%. It was more driving down from what they were asking for to that point so that we could be somewhat consistent.
Okay, thank you.
All of them came in much higher than 2.5% with their requests. And again, that's to be expected, and that's the negotiation process, but there was no artificial raising.
Well, I wasn't insinuating artificial. I was just insinuating where equity doesn't exist, driving for equity, even if it meant increasing expenses. But nonetheless, you've answered my question. I appreciate it. I see where you're coming from. I think the other issue that was raised in Ed's questioning had to, at least it conveyed the sense that the city had an obligation to the collective bargaining units to explain to them how they would use any reserves or monies that sit in the budget at the conclusion of a fiscal year that were increases beyond that which was expected. So are we saying that, and obviously the budget of the city is very transparent. Anybody can have access to it. All they need to do is go to the website. They can see what's going on. They can visit this meeting here that we're having. They can visit city council meetings. They can listen to the discussions and debates, and they know what the financial situation of the city is. But, does the city really have an obligation to explain to the collective bargaining units how those additional reserves that are realized are going to be used, or that they should be set aside for enhancing the collective bargaining agreement provisions? And I ask that because, reserve one year may end up being a deficit the next year. And certainly the political implications are one such that we can certainly anticipate and project out that the deficit may be covered, by conservative budgeting and stuff like that over the next 24 months. But then again, on the other side, the city council also can all of a sudden to have an epiphany and decide that they want to take the property tax rate down a penny or two, which can create a whole nother dynamic for whatever reason. And when they see reserves that are consistently appearing, the politics of the situation may encourage some city council members to advocate for a tax decrease. And we've seen that happen, in the city before on a number of occasions when actually that tax decrease may not have been warranted. That rate decrease may not have been warranted. So I guess my concern, more or less a comment rather than a question, is that there are variables out there down the road over the next 24 months that certainly need to be accounted for when we, look at what the structural deficit is and how these collective bargaining agreements may affect that structural deficit one way or the other, absent the ARPA money, which will soon be depleted at one point or another down the road. So I just kind of want to put that out there. And certainly would welcome any comment on that, but, some of the other questions I have would follow. Taking a look at the staff report and fiscal note, and again, going back to police unions, I'm looking at local 400, and again, I'm looking at the staff report, and I'm going down all the different bulleted points. You have Article 10, health and life insurance, increase in funeral and burial cremation expense. I go to the collective bargaining agreement, I go to Article 10, and Article 10 is union visitation. I don't see anything in there about death benefits. So is that a error in the physical note and staff report? I might also add that when looking at Article 11, right below that, I again go to the police report, or rather the police collective bargaining agreement, and I go to Article 11, and Article 11 refers to work rules, and this says retiree health insurance, Article 11 on the staff report. So again, I don't know that we were directed to the right area of the CBA there. Could you help direct us to where these items are in the appropriate articles, please?
Yeah. All right, so. So Article 24 is health and welfare benefits, retiree medical is in 24.5.
Okay, so rather than referring to Article 10 and 11, we should be referring to Article, you said 24.
Yeah, I believe that was something that should have been corrected in our communications with our labor attorney when they were doing the final summary for us. We'll get it corrected. Thank you so much for pointing that out.
Okay, thank you. Article 23, paragraphs 23.6 and 23.7. And let me go to those articles here for police and fire. Or rather for police, I'm sorry.
Right.
23, 23.6 and 23.7. And I guess this, refers to perhaps it may have a physical impact. I just need clarification. In 23.6, no officer shall be permitted to work more than 16 consecutive hours unless there occurs a major civil emergency, natural disaster, so forth and so on. And 23.7 says an officer shall be given a minimum of 10 days notice of any change in scheduled days off. If the employer requires an officer to work a scheduled day off with less than 10 days notice, the officer shall be paid overtime at a rate of 1.5 times the regularly hourly rate. And, my question is, how does a major civil emergency, natural disaster, or other unusual circumstance affect paragraph 23.7? And if in 23.6, does overtime kick in for an officer that has worked more than 16 hours if they have to address such a civil emergency and so forth?
So 23.6 is kind of a health and welfare statement, meaning that you won't put individuals into an excessive consecutive work hour position. And then, but there are going to be extraordinary times. So it gives the city the right to determine in an emergency situation that they can exceed the 16 hours. So that is a management oriented benefit there, to allow for that declaration to be made, and that is a declaration that's otherwise defined as the responsibility of the police chief to determine. The 10 days notice was an attempt to give where there's the potential for notice to be identified for the officer, so it's not on management's part a late notice before they're put in that situation, and that they just are looking for a premium rate if they don't honor the notice period. But overtime, the overtime rate is time and a half. So in many, many cases, and there's non-pyramiding provisions in there, so you can't get time and a half under this provision and also time and a half in an overtime situation.
But how does a major civil emergency or natural disaster affect 23.7? Because you won't be able to give 10 days notice if there's a major civil emergency or natural disaster.
So 23.7 really speaks to if there's a change in assignment. So if someone is assigned to the patrol squad and then they get reassigned to midnights and they were on day work before, that's what that 10-day provision covers, because it refers to scheduled days off. 23.6 really also relates to overtime. It doesn't allow an officer to take because the patrol shifts are 12 hours, it doesn't allow an officer to take the day work overtime for 12 hours and then go straight into their midnights, which is another 12 hours, and that would put them at a full 24 hours. The exceptions to that would be if there is, for example, when we had a tornado last year, that if they have to order people in to handle some of the sort of side effects of the tornado, while the other officers are regularly scheduled to work patrol. So I think that there's probably not going to be very many instances where 23.6 and 23.7 kind of overlap. But if it were, then the officer would be given that 1.5 times pay, because they're either probably being ordered in for involuntary overtime, which is time and a half anyway.
Okay. Does there need to be clarification then added to that one particular paragraph as Carrie outlined it?
No, because they know this is about scheduling, and as Carrie said, the 23.7 isn't really about bringing somebody in to work on their scheduled day off. This is about setting up the schedule that has the scheduled days off built into it. So when you change shifts, or change assignments, you may have individuals going from a 12-hour day to an 8-hour day, for example. And so you need to make sure that the way you align those shifts, you're giving people appropriate notice so that they are aware of the impact on what they understood to be their scheduled days off.
Okay, but irregardless, with both of those paragraphs, regardless, the overtime provisions would kick in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, in Article 25 of the same collective bargaining agreement, I just want to confirm that in our previous meeting, Tricia, last week, you had indicated that this drop function was expense neutral. Is that correct?
It is. In fact, the police have a maximum number of 12 enrolled at any one time. And fire has a maximum of 12 as well. We have 9 total individuals enrolled in drop. So we are clearly cost neutral. We are below even the projected numbers on that. They changed in the current agreement, the current 4-year agreement, from the drop provisions of the calculation amount changed, and a mandatory 4-year enrollment when it was 3 before. And so you'll see in the fire agreement, they asked for an additional optional 5th year. And we made sure that they couldn't increase the enrollment numbers. That was our way of calculating the cost neutrality. And so because they can't increase you can try to enroll for a 5th year, but if you're already maxed out in the number of enrollees, that wouldn't be accepted. Okay. So we've maintained that to
Okay.
ensure that we've got cost neutrality.
Okay, thank you. Okay, in Article 28, and I apologize if I'm looking away from the screen while I'm talking to you because I'm reading from my notes here from when I reviewed the agreement. So if I'm looking away, again, my apologies. This involves training that an FTO provides to either a probationary officer or to a police cadet or trainee. And my questions are as follows. Does this training that the FTO provide occur during the FTO's regular assigned work schedule, or does this training occur outside of the FTO's regular work schedule?
So the FTO needs to accomplish the tasks associated with field training. The individual employee that's going through field training is assigned to the officer, the FTO. And as I understand, they essentially ride along with them, that it's, if they have any tasks to complete associated with that, they just need to accomplish it. They need to make sure they fill out the appropriate paperwork. They need to make sure the record keeping is done appropriately and that they meet the objectives and expectations during the specified period of time. You see that we increased the amount from before. What we were getting feedback on is that we're having a lot of difficulty in getting people to sign up voluntarily to be FTOs because it just wasn't worth their time with the amount of effort. We have CALIA standards, we have commission standards that have to be met, and so they have to be documented. And I think the level of, I really try not to use this word ever, but the level of bureaucracy and expectation of record keeping is pretty significant. So $100 a day was something that they were able to provide with grant monies, but clearly it's something that has helped tremendously in recruiting individuals to be FTOs.
Okay, so really there is no possibility of overtime being involved when it comes to training then, is that correct?
That's I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that question, but that never came up as a concern or a belief during the collective bargaining process.
Okay.
That's a flat rate. They're not going to increase that amount.
No, but
I can probably answer the question. I did miss the first part. Were you asking whether or not a field training officer may get called in for overtime to train a trainee?
or whether a field officer may fall into overtime because they are providing training. And in addition to that overtime, they're getting the additional stipend on top of it.
So the way, because the field training officers are all in patrol. And so there are a certain amount of field training officers on each patrol squad. So there's not going to be an instance where an officer is called in on overtime to train the trainee. If for whatever reason the squad doesn't have the field training officer, then the trainee gets shifted to another squad. So someone isn't going to get called in for overtime. Whether they may be held over their normal tour of duty because of report writing, report review, and things of that nature. I can't say with certainty that that's something that happens frequently. I'm sure it has happened, but I don't think it happens at a rate that it's never really been discussed. So they may push it back to the next shift because generally they either work 2 shifts in a row or 3 shifts in a row. So it may be just pushed back to the next shift, but it's not something that happens with any rate of frequency.
Okay. In paragraph 28.10 of the same collective bargaining agreement, and this deals with employees assigned to the criminal investigations section. And it stipulates that they shall receive 14 hours of compensatory time for a full calendar week of on-call status. On-call employees who do not complete a full week of on-call status will receive 2 hours of compensatory time for a 24-hour period covered. Are there specific requirements beyond being available when needed that these on-call officers must adhere to, e.g. like refraining from alcohol consumption, travel distance restrictions from, the jurisdiction and so forth, that might serve as a rationale for such compensatory time.
Yes, that's part of what we were hearing. Is that those
Okay.
individuals, because, and as I'm sure as a citizen of the city, you've seen, with the homicide numbers and some of the significant crimes, this group is really called into action quite frequently.
Okay, so there are specific at work requirements when they're on call that they need to be in close proximity to the jurisdiction. They cannot be consuming alcohol to any great degree or extent, and what other type of work requirements?
Yes, they have. So our drug and alcohol policy is also attached to this agreement, I'm pretty sure. So in short answer, yes.
Okay, so that certainly justifies the compensatory time and what's being asked there because of those additional work requirements. While we're on compensatory time, although compensatory time does not require, well, at least initially does not require a cash outlay, nonetheless, compensatory time is an expense factor. Is compensatory time accounted for in the fiscal impact statement that's been provided to us? The dollar value of that compensatory time.
So comp time is accumulated in the pay system and paid out as regular salary as it's used. So the only time that it would have impact is if somebody uses their comp time and somebody else has to fill in for them when they're there and it's an overtime shift. And the cost of overtime has been projected just on what we currently incur, and then the increases related to this contract. So I would think it would be embedded in the numbers, although not quantified what we're storing in comp time.
Well, much like vacation time, which has to be accrued for,
Well, that's the same thing that we're doing.
compensatory time has to be accrued for, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is accrued for. It's accrued
Okay.
for in our payroll system and used. And if they leave, at the time they leave, some gets paid out depending on our caps, because we do have caps on it.
Okay.
But that's the same as it is currently.
Okay, so that compensatory time is accounted for in the fiscal impact statement.
Indirectly and embedded within other amounts. We don't have a separate line item that tries to quantify comp time.
Okay, so do you have an accrual for compensatory time like you do for vacation time or not?
So no, comp time has to be used. As far as what has to be paid out, I'm not sure if it's in our year-end accrual process.
I think that the police department has a maximum number of hours that somebody can.
Because I think that we have to assume they're going to use their comp time and
Right.
not have it paid out, but we do accrue for outstanding vacation leave, anything that could be taken with as people leave that could be taken. We do that at the end of the year.
Another factor, Bob, is that in paying out of leave, so if an individual uses compensatory leave in place of using their annual leave, so to, as an example, the maximum payout when somebody leaves the city in annual leave is 30 days.
Okay. And that is
So
accrued.
that's another control. And so they can't carry over more than 30 days of annual leave in any calendar year.
Mhm.
And so we have something that we call leave chop. And so if they exceed that amount, they could stand the chance of losing the excess amount.
Mhm.
Employees that are members of VIBA, which do not include police and fire, are able to use that annual leave chop for their VIBA account.
Mhm.
But police and fire do not.
Excuse me, Bob, if I may interrupt you just for a second. So we all know where we're going. Do you intend to go through this whole process for every one of these agreements?
No, not necessarily, because some of them are duplicative.
Okay, go ahead. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
no, that's, I'm getting towards the end here, Fred. Don't worry, I'm not gonna keep us here. I just need some clarifications as to physical impact and stuff like that. But again, Tricia, with the cap, the 30-day cap on payouts, that, and Jody, this is to you too, that is accrued for in the budget. The potential of that cap having to be activated.
You're saying accrued for in the budget. So we cannot budget because we don't know when they're going to leave. We don't know who's going to leave and when they're going to leave. So we budget based on cash out the door. If any of my employees leave and they have accumulated time, that is not in the budget. It never has been in the budget. If we have excessive number of people leaving or somebody leaves and takes a big bite, then we have to transfer budget at year end to try to cover for that. Now, typically, you know that when you lose an employee that has the accumulated leave, there's turnover that follows that, meaning there's salary savings because nobody's in that position for part of the year. So that has, in my experience, most of the time covered what the payout is when somebody leaves. We have that issue in all departments. It's nothing we can try to calculate or compensate from a budgetary perspective. But the turnover savings typically covers that. The only time you have an exception is when you have a department of 2 people or 3 people, and one of them leaves and takes a huge payout, and then you fill a position right away. Then you would have a problem at the end of the year for the budget.
Okay, well, my line of questioning on this is one that the city is on an accrual form of accounting, as I understand it. Okay, not a cash accounting system.
We account for it in the financial statements, but when we're preparing our budget estimates for the next year, we do not try to calculate how many people are going to leave and what their leave take is going to be. And I don't know of any government that does that because it's too difficult to try to project.
Well, in the private sector, it's done very often, even among large corporations and small businesses, the concept of accrual for anticipated expense, particularly when it involves compensatory time, vacation time, and so forth. So that's why I asked the question. But as I understand it, that is not being accrued for. It's just when the expense occurs, it occurs, and you have to find some way to cover that expense.
Yes.
That's the response that I'm
getting.
getting.
Yes, and we typically do because the position is then vacant for a few weeks to months.
Okay, very good. Perhaps that's something that may need to be revisited down the road.
All the leave here at the city, all leave is capped. We have a cap on everybody. So you can't accumulate a huge amount and get a half year's worth of salary when you leave. Everybody's capped.
I understand, but you still accrue for it nonetheless, at least in my opinion. We have a disagreement there, and it's not the way the city does it. And that's that. Maybe it could be a recommendation down the road. When we're looking at Article 37, we're dealing with grant monies that are used to supplement income for police officers. This particular article deals with multilingual pay. The employer and union agree to continue current practices regarding multilingual pay until the employer no longer receives a grant to fund the same. In the event the grant ceases, the employer agrees to meet with the union to create a plan to address multilingual pay, which means if the grant expires, then that money has to come from someplace else if we're going to continue multilingual services and pay that goes along with it. And I might add that this also could be a similar occurrence in other areas of collective bargaining agreements with this particular unit, or was one, 2, or 3 of the other units. I guess my questions are along several lines. First of all, if there's going to be an expiration of the grant, is there any advance notice that the city receives that a grant would potentially not be renewed or potentially could be under review for not being renewed. But where this money is used to supplement income. of a-
Typically, when a grant is going to expire, the department will be aware that the granting agency is not going to continue the program. We have some advance notice. I don't know if we have a year's advance notice or 6 months, or if we could get to the end of a fiscal year and be surprised to find out that we don't have the money coming in the following year. That's a possibility as well.
Okay, but what are the possibilities that the grant could not be renewed during the fiscal year once the budget has already been set and determined?
So we often, so that's a possibility, that doesn't happen frequently. We often have grants that we've estimated, for instance, we're gonna get $500,000. But we don't get $500,000, we get $400,000. And we adjust the grant appropriation downward to match.
Okay, so you don't try to supplement that $100,000 hypothetically with money from someplace else in the general fund?
I think it's going to depend on what the grant is for. If the grant is paying for something that's additional, we may consider cutting that benefit or whatever the grant's paying for. If
Okay.
it's like something that's just supplementing ongoing expenses and that activity had to continue, then we'd have to consider backfilling it with something, or just not using grant funds for the expense, leaving those expenses in the general fund. I think it depends.
Okay, so does this Article 37 predetermine that the city will continue to fund a multilingual pay, or make a commitment that the city will continue to fund it if the grant expires?
So I'll leave that to Tricia or Carrie to answer on the wording, because I don't have the wording in front of me and it's more of a legal issue.
So the language just says that if, and I believe currently the funding is coming from what is formerly GOCAP, but now is the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention and Youth and Victim Services. If there's no longer grant funding coming from that source, it just says that the city and the union will meet and discuss potential ways to continue to fund it if at all feasible. I don't think it is making it or putting the city in a position that it's going to continue to fund the multilingual pay, but it is putting the city and the union in the position to try to come up and meet and confer and come up with a way to continue it should the grant funding cease. But it is not a commitment that the funding will continue after or if the grant funding ceases.
It was a recognition that there was a potential for the grant funding to cease. And what we were trying to do is acknowledge that that was in fact an economic benefit to members of the union, even though the source was from a grant. And we were trying to put language in the CBA that allowed the city to seek grants that may give economic benefits to the members of the bargaining unit and get credit for that. In terms of one of the values of the economics for the members of the union. As what Carrie said is absolutely true. That was not a commitment to fund. It was a commitment to come back and discuss.
Okay, then, the language somewhat of this article perhaps led me to misunderstand then, because as I read it, it says the employer agrees to meet with the union to create a plan to address multilingual pay. To create a plan to address multilingual, which from a layman's standpoint in reading this, not that I was involved in the negotiations, but that would indicate to me, and from a union perspective, it would indicate to me that, hey, the city is going to commit to find a way to, continue multilingual pay if the grant expires. That's the way I read it. But if I misunderstood that, then, the language caused me to misunderstand that. Perhaps I don't understand the nuance there then.
In any regard, that is something that is subject to collective bargaining. If we have an existing union agreement in place, we enter into something that we call a side letter of agreement. So we have a very similar process we need to go through before there's, it can't be at the insistence or the action of any one party. We have to formalize that.
Okay. Coming over to the fire
Mhm.
collective bargaining agreement in Article 1, as I read it there, apparently captains are being added to the collective bargaining unit. Is that correct? And are captains considered a management position within the fire department?
Within the bylaws of the union, there's the ability to separate, as you can see, a unit 1 and a unit 2. So the unit 1 are the ranks of firefighter and firefighter first class, and unit 2 are in the ranks of lieutenant and captain.
Okay, so you're saying that they were already in the collective bargaining unit in one form or another.
The lieutenants were.
Okay, and then the city committed to adding the captains into it?
Correct.
Okay, was that a discretionary commitment on the part of the city, or was that something that they were required to do by law?
The members of the rank of captain had submitted a petition to join. Legally, under the code, they had submitted a petition to become members. We entertained that during the collective bargaining process.
Okay, so the city council has an opportunity to weigh in on that then, as to whether to accept that or not. Is that correct? It's not a requirement, whereas other language in the collective bargaining agreements are required either by state code or by city code or whatever the case may be to, for conformity.
I don't, Carrie, I'm not sure how to answer that question.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, basically what's being portrayed is that there's a set of bylaws that say that, yeah, captains as well as lieutenants could be included in the collective bargaining unit. Lieutenants are in the collective bargaining unit, captains aren't. Well, the captains got together and decided, hey, we kind of want to be in the collective bargaining unit, so we're going to petition the city to do this. Okay, my question is, does the city have an obligation, legally or otherwise, i.e. the city lacks any discretionary latitude when it comes to determining whether captains are part of the collective bargaining unit or not?
So I think the only parameter surrounding the city's decision-making is there's language in the code that says supervisory and non-supervisory personnel cannot be in the same unit, which is why Article 1 has Unit 1 that has the non-supervisory personnel, and Unit 2 has the supervisory personnel. And it creates that distinguishing set of units. But other than that, we haven't, the city has no control over what the bylaws are for Local 1926. They have their process to accept the captains. There was a letter that said that the 1926 went through their whole process and procedure. The captains were accepted as part of the bargaining unit. And then at that point, it was just making sure that the city code is followed to ensure that there's a separation between the supervisory and non-supervisory personnel.
Okay, so the city has no discretionary ability in this issue at all.
In general, yes. I mean, I think if they wanted to remain in one unit and there was no, let's say, allowance in their bylaws to separate units, and it was just the 1926 Unit 1, then that would give the city the discretion to say that's a violation of the code. Therefore, these supervisory personnel cannot be in the same unit. But since their 1926's local bylaws allow for separation into separate units, but still maintain recognition as an employee organization over those two separate units, then it does take away, I guess, the discretion that you're referring to.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. So there's no discretionary opportunity there for the city. I think that, that pretty much covers, Just a second here. Let me. Okay, I think that covers my questions, Fred. Thank you for indulging me, and thank you to the
Thank you,
administration for
you're
answering
very
my
enlightening.
questions.
Yeah, and I know that you spent a lot of time and you really dug into it, and I appreciate that. So thank you for your question, even though it sometimes took a little longer than we might have wanted, but I think you were able to generate some fairly good responses to most of them. Let me just go back for one in terms of typos in the police agreement, Article 17 holidays. One of them, I think, is material, and this is on page 9, towards the bottom of the page. In lieu of these holidays, all officers shall receive 11 (12) annual leave days. I think that needs to be corrected, so there is no ambiguity there. And 17.2 at the top of the next page, in the second line, there's an extraneous 17.3. I don't know if that should be tabbed, so it's a separate paragraph, 17.3, and then 17.3 becomes 17.4 or whatever. And similarly, in 17.3, second line toward the end, there's an extraneous G. I'm not sure whether that has any substantive intent or it's just a typo. So I want to bring those to your attention. Ed, you're back. Welcome back. Let me go around the table
Thank
again. Ed, do you have any further questions? Bob's finished. I'm finished.
Hang on one split second. Sorry, I had taken various notes, and let me just take a quick look to see if I've gone through. Oh, yeah, maybe there was one other one on the financial aspects here, but I think it's a quick one. Is so on the COLAs, and then just a little bit of what I'll call Google research. Okay, meaning I'm getting a flavor of something out there, but you're going to know a whole lot better on the staff level. Is it right? There was a recent contract negotiation that the state went through. Maybe this goes back to like January or something in that neighborhood. And and I don't know the details, but there were reports about the state having put in COLAs over the next 2 years for various unionized employees, where they were doing 3% in year 1 and then 2% in year 2. And so I think the arithmetic works out that by the second year, then the employees end up at the same place they would be. So 2.5% each year, or 3% and 2%, you actually mathematically end up in the same place from the employee's perspective. But there's a difference in cash flow if you're putting 3% and 2 as opposed to 2.5 and 2.5. What I'm getting at is, so the state just went through a process where they were looking at COLAs, and they're just wondering, to what extent, if at all, did we look into that as a basis for helping us to determine what made sense on COLAs and one-time bonuses and things of that nature? Or is what I'm talking about with what the state may have done something that's you really kind of considered irrelevant?
Well, I don't think that any of that drove what we were trying to do, and nor when we were in this process are we tracking what everybody else is doing with their agreement process and using it as a basis for our only the fact that we know other jurisdictions are giving increases, and that we need to make sure that we stay competitive for the job market. I don't know if anybody has anything more to add to that.
Okay, all right,
Okay,
now
Tricia,
that's,
you-
yeah, that's it. Those are my questions. And I apologize. My break took longer than I had anticipated. But I thank you for the questions that I was able to ask earlier, and I think the answers were very helpful to understand it. I mean, I have opinions and views, which we can get to at the appropriate time.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ed. Patrick, do you have any further questions you want to put forth? You're muted. You're muted.
Yeah. No, not at this time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. I appreciate all of the questions and comments so far from commission members. And do any of staff have any supplementation they want to make to what has already been said? No, so
I'll just say that we appreciate all of the good questions and the good discussion. And Bob, we certainly appreciate your very thorough review and all of your good questions. I think that's how this process is supposed to go. So, so we appreciate it very much.
Bob?
Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, thank you, David. I just a quick review with some information that we did request, just so that, you know, we can clarify what additional information we've asked for. I think one is that, Jody, you indicated that you would be able to get back to us as to what the fiscal impact over a 2-year period of time, these collective bargaining.
I don't believe I have any outstanding questions. I told you that if you're each of those, we're going to spend each of those $5 million numbers in each year. If you add them together, what the cost of 2 years is, the cost of those 2 years. I don't think I owe you anything unless I haven't clarified it adequately.
Okay, so we're talking 5.7 million.
I think it was
Plus-
5.6 million in year one, 5.7 million year two.
Okay, very good. The city attorney was going to get back to us. Patrick, yeah, we see
Yeah.
Patrick there.
I did have a question. Now, does that 5.6, 5.7, does that include the bonus money too, or is that separate?
That includes the bonus money.
Okay.
It's that staff report that was attached to the email with all the materials. If you scroll down to the bottom of it, you'll see a schedule broken out by fund, broken out by year, broken out by feature of the estimated fiscal impact.
Okay.
And the bonuses are there. They're the last line in each section.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I just wanted to say that we will make the corrections to the staff report and the CBAs that you brought forth and make sure you get an updated version of that.
Okay, thank you. And then Carrie, the city attorney, is going to get back to us on that with a legal opinion so that we more thoroughly understand going forward. You know,
Yeah, he's aware. I sent him an email and he knows that you guys are looking for it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'd like to begin the discussion with a few comments, and my views may not be shared by others, but that's fine. That's the purpose of this exercise. I've read the agreements, I read the staff report, listened to staff presentation, and certainly listened to the very thoughtful question posed by Bob, Ed, and Patrick, and responses the staff has given. We, as a fact, historically have been charged with and have taken the position that we look at things from a 20,000 foot level, not down in the weeds. We are not given any specific responsibility with respect to reviewing and commenting on collective bargaining agreements. The language in the code is very, very general, and actually, I believe it's even discretionary. So we are charged with, have the authority to provide comments to the city council regarding collective bargaining agreements as we see fit. I haven't heard anything at 20,000 foot level that said to me that these collective bargaining agreements, should not be approved. I was not, nor were we, members of the negotiating team. We were not involved in the discussions and deliberations. We do not and have, we're not privy to all of the nuances of this entire process. I think I'm very happy that we were shared with as much information as we were today about, the discussions during the collective bargaining process, which typically are confidential, certainly while the process is ongoing. And I know when we asked previously for information, I think David quite correctly said, well, this negotiating process is confidential until it's finished. Well, it's finished, and now we've been told. I think, Bob and Patrick, a few of you, have asked very legitimate questions geared toward the pretty high dollar amounts or percentage amounts for the police contract and recruitment and retention. I am personally satisfied with the responses that we got. I personally don't need to see any, actual chart or data from the exit interviews of officers who have left. I believe that, and working with a number of police departments in the various cities and towns that I represent, that the management team, management officers from the department, chief, deputy chief, and working down who were part of the process, I believe they probably shared with the rest of the negotiating team information regarding the operations of the department and the reasons why various officers have left. And there's probably more than sufficient anecdotal information to support the position that there has been a recruitment and retention issue in the department that these negotiations have attempted to address. We didn't hear much about either the AFSCME contract, perhaps because those issues or some of the more difficult issues there were discussed with respect to the police. When I first saw the fiscal impact note and read the contracts, I was flabbergasted at the amounts of money that we were talking about. And in terms of the increase in the pay scale, in terms of the cost of living adjustment, the COLA adjustment, plus the $3,000 per year supplementation or bonuses for all city employees except the police. However, having heard staff's explanation as to why those numbers and amounts and types of additional income were provided, I am not as troubled by by those amounts and that kind of breakdown. So all of that having been said, I do not oppose or object to the council's approval of these collective bargaining agreements. There's nothing I think that is so critical that we would need to say, whoa, you need to address X, you need to address Y, you need to address Z in terms of the down in the weeds individual particular sections of the agreements. I'm looking at it again from from the bigger picture. So those are my comments and my thoughts, and I'd like to throw the floor open to Patrick, Ed, Bob, and I don't care in what particular direction or order you want to proceed, but we open it up to somebody to continue with comments. Bob?
Fred, thank you for your comments. I certainly appreciate them and understand where you're coming from. I think that these collective bargaining agreements do have a fiscal impact on the city. And I think that in conveying our advisory opinion to the city council, we need to identify and confirm what that fiscal impact is and the potential of what that physical impact may have on the city during the course of the 2 years that these collective bargaining agreements are in place, and what they may potentially set up going into 2025. The city is going to have to add this dimension into their deliberations when it comes to identifying appropriate revenue sources to be able to meet, the additional expenses that these collective bargaining agreements are going to be placing upon the city. I do believe that is a role and a function of the fact, and one that we're responsible for delivering. I would not anticipate the fact giving or rendering any opinions down into the minutia on some of the questions that we got into, but some of those questions I feel did, convey a pattern, if you will, as to, some of the decision making, some of the thoughts that went into the decision making and the negotiating positions, to help us understand better what the city was trying to accomplish. But nonetheless, there is, without question, a fiscal impact on the city. That fiscal impact is greater, will be greater than what it would be under the previous collective bargaining agreements. We need to identify that, and we need to provide advisory opinions to the city council as to how they're going to be able to address that in this subsequent near term, at least next 2 years, and going into the potential of the third year. I do think that Ed raised some very important issues, concerning COLAs. I do think that the issue of defined benefits versus defined contributions, which is not something new that has come up. We've been discussing it for a number of years, and Ed has brought it back to the forefront as it should have been. I'm a little bit disappointed that was not at least brought up as a potential discussion point in subsequent collective bargaining agreements, particularly the next one that may be entered into after these collective bargaining agreements expire in 2 years. But nonetheless, those are, issues that, that need to be addressed, down the road. Those are my thoughts on the process and how I feel the fact should be responding. So thank you.
Bob, let me ask you just to follow up your thoughts. Are you recommending that the fact take a position to reject the collective bargaining agreements?
No,
Or,
I'm not making a recommendation. I'm sorry. No,
Not
go
just
ahead.
say reject, approve, or take no position as to rejection or approval, but focus on pointing out some of the issues with the agreements that you mentioned.
That, I think my position is one that we have a responsibility to advise the council that if they approve the agreements as are, this will be the physical impact to the city. And that physical impact will have to be addressed and deliberated upon in the short term, i.e. over the next 36 months. And revenue sources are going to have to be identified to be able to be able to address that physical impact. It's going to be up to the city council whether they want to accept or reject the collective bargaining agreements in whole or in part. I think Ed did raise some very good issues for discussion when it comes to COLAs. And I think that I hope the city council will understand, what those challenges are involved in the COLAs and where we sit on those as a result of these negotiations. But beyond that, I think our primary responsibility and our communication to the city council is to help them understand the physical impact, and that it will require that physical impact will need to be addressed in one manner, shape, or form over the course of the next 36 months to be sure that the city maintains a financially sustainable position going forward.
Thank you, Bob, for clarifying your position. Either Patrick or Ed, who wants to go first?
I'm in agreement with what Bob said, nothing additional. Thanks.
Okay. Ed?
Yeah, so first, I recognize I missed some dialogue. I again apologize for that. And so if there was anything in there that affects what I'm about to say, you'll know it. We can talk about it. But I guess here's my point of view on this. I think everybody at the staff level has done a very good job, treated it sincerely, acted in good faith, and I have nothing negative whatsoever to say or to imply at all. Period. New sentence. Is my concern here is that the combination of the COLA and the one-time, we're calling it different names, but they combine to increase the benefits being provided, and then therefore they combine to increase the costs. I'm concerned that we are dipping further into the ARPA funds. I'm concerned that we are counting upon revenue to bounce back post-COVID, that we're expecting housing, the property tax revenue to pick up. We all have our own little crystal balls, and none of them, are necessarily as accurate as anything else, and only time will tell. But my reading of that is that we should be cautious in expecting property tax revenue to increase, because there are, of course, signs with the interest rates being moved up so radically that housing prices are softening, that there will be pressure on sellers to accept lower prices. We may see a decline in housing values, which could affect property tax revenues in a negative way rather than a positive. And all of you were in the driver's seat, and I'm not going to second guess, because you had to make the decisions that you had to make for understandable reasons. But where I think it leaves the city, if these collective bargaining agreements as a total are approved, is that we are raising compensation above anybody's concept of an inflation rate. I don't think that there's an analysis that would justify finding that it would make sense for the city of Annapolis to be ahead of the state of Maryland on COLAs. I don't think there's an analysis that we've done that suggests the inflation rate in the city of Annapolis is above the national average or even on par with the national average. And I think that the collective bargaining agreements as a total are too generous. That's my personal judgment. And what I don't know is what are the consequences financially or from a service provision point of view to the city of these collective bargaining agreements being rejected. I understand that would mean we'd have to go back to the negotiating table. I would like to recommend that they be rejected because I think they're too rich. But I do not feel personally comfortable enough with the consequences to the city of a rejection to make that as a formal recommendation. But I do want to raise a red flag that's getting bigger and redder over time that we are setting the city up for 2 to 3 years from now, no later, having to confront that choice that we talked about earlier and that, others have mentioned. We are going to have to find more money or we're going to have to cut expenses. And if we're in that choice, there's pressure on tax increases. That's a political decision. And that's what ultimately keeps me from hesitating to say reject these CBAs. It's a political decision. Does this council and mayor want to be 2 to 3 years from now in a position of having to raise taxes or having to lay people off? And I think that these CBAs bring us closer to that decision point. And I, for one, would have liked to have seen a stronger situation where it was you can have a one-time bonus or you can have a COLA. And the one-time bonus is better because it doesn't fit into the base. So I think the negotiating strategy as it initially was put together and initially presented of trying to address the inflationary pressures and the negotiations that always have to happen by going in with we'll give you a one-time, but you won't get a COLA. Had that position been maintained, I might still have somewhat different judgments on the numbers, but I could understand that concept and that principle as being rock solid, since it developed into a one-time bonus plus a COLA. It's too expensive in my view. So laying it out, not trying to pull the punches, but I want to be very respectful of what everybody has done because I do understand the situation you're in. I'm not going to fly spec, nor do I think it's the role of this commission to fly spec things about, disciplinary issues. And if somebody gets in trouble, should that come off their record 2 years later as opposed to 5 years later? And, remarriage penalties and pensions. And there's a lot of detail here that I think it's not appropriate for the fact to be in. But the big picture financial to me is adding to what we've been talking about, the structural deficit and the near-term concern. And that's my perspective on this.
Thank you very much for those cogent words, Ed. I appreciate them and certainly respect them. And actually, I do, despite my earlier comments, I do agree with what, in large part, with what you and Bob had commented. Comments, questions from anybody else?
Hey, Fred, sorry, may I add just one very narrow, quick point?
Sure.
This other point is maybe harder to evaluate from the commission point of view. So I'd maybe flag it as something that I would suggest would warrant additional scrutiny. Maybe just put it at that level. Is with the police, I understand that the judgment of the city council to maintain a separate police force. I have come during the course of this meeting to understand more about regional cooperation, and all of that makes perfect rational sense. Okay, the issues of retention and recruitment are not necessarily one and the same, and it was not entirely clear to me based on the discussion that I heard and prior discussions as to whether we have two problems, meaning both recruitment and retention, or if we do have two problems, which one is greater. My impression is that our greater problem is retention, not recruitment. you will know better if that's accurate, but if that's accurate, then in future negotiations, trying to target financial incentives for people to remain long-term is a narrower and more focused way to address that problem, rather than, as what I understand here, we basically raised the initial salary from give or take 50 grand to 60 grand, and then that flows upward or trickles upward, I think was the phrase somebody was using. So I would just urge, without really taking a position, because you know better than I do, whether there could be focus in future negotiations on a narrower slice of the issue rather than across the board, which it sounds like happened here. And maybe there was no way to avoid that. But that's a thought that I guess I just want to put out there for further consideration.
Ed,
So in
thank you
fact,
very
we
much
do
for-
have a recruitment issue for police. So that was a big driver on the entry pay. And retention then is addressed by making the scale adjustment.
Okay, so the question is where we go from here. I've heard, all the comments, and my thought or suggestion is that I prepare a draft of a letter to the city council, following along the lines that Bob and Ed have suggested, that I circulated to commission members for review and comment, back to me, again, to avoid open meetings issues of simultaneous communications among the quorum and board, similar to the process we followed with our budget letter. And then I think we, once we come to a informal agreement as to the substance and form of the letter, then we get back together for just a few minutes to finalize it and formalize it and have an approval, just as we did with the budget letter. Does that sound like an appropriate plan, or would somebody else prefer to take a first crack at the letter?
I think you're very good at it, Fred. I would
Hearing,
defer to you.
Okay.
I'll defer to you as well.
I think I think you guys did a very good job in supplementing and revising, my first draft last time, and I think it worked well as a team. What I'd like to do, and David, when is it that you all would like our response by?
So
27?
Fred, the meeting is on June 27th. The next city council meeting on June 27th. So that's when they're going to consider the legislation for the CBAs.
Okay, so really, if we want to have any realistic hope of the mayor and council having an opportunity to review whatever it is we say, we're going to have to get it to them next week. Is that fair to say, or?
Yeah, it would be most helpful if it's by next week, Friday. So that the council would have a chance to review it prior to the Monday council meeting.
Okay.
Yeah, Fred,
Bob?
Fred, yeah, we were able in the previous, letter that we submitted to advisory opinion that we submitted to the council, we were able to turn that around about 2 to 3 days. Again, I don't know what your schedule is to be able to do the first
Bob,
draft.
I had blocked out the day today for this,
Okay.
anticipating that we'd have a lengthy meeting this morning, and then this afternoon I would try and put together a draft of the letter.
Okay, good. Then
I've been monitoring on my phone, my office emails to see what real work I have coming into it that I have to tend to. And fortunately, there's only one thing I need to address, and that should take me about 10 minutes.
okay.
So what my hope, because I want to get this off our plate collectively. My hope is that I can get a draft of a letter out today, by the end of the day, or tomorrow at the latest. Give everybody the weekend to review it, to comment on it, edit it, and get it back to me. And then I can put together, I think my schedule, well, I'll have to make the time, put together a revision, get it out for consensus. And then, hopefully my thought is maybe a meeting next Thursday morning. How does that work for schedules? And again, this is just, I believe, just a meeting for the purpose of the fact collectively taking a final look-see at a draft letter and approving it for distribution to the mayor and council. First, Matt, well, I'll put it out to everybody, including Madeline with Annapolis TV, whether next, Thursday morning at 8 o'clock will work. I see Ed saying yes. I know I'm okay. Bob saying yes. Pat, so we at least have a quorum, that can attend next Thursday morning at 8. And I would hope that this would be a relatively brief meeting. The only purpose is to review final draft of the letter that everybody will have seen, that all the commission members will have seen, approve it, and say thank you and be gone. So I'll leave it up to staff as to whether you need and want to be there. That's up to you. Madeline, will that work for Annapolis TV?
So I just looked at the calendar and there's not any conflicting meetings, and I think that it should work and we'll be able to staff it. So I can give a preliminary yes, but as usual, I'll just have to touch base with Mark and confirm.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions or comments from staff? If not, again, I appreciate your attendance and all the hard work you all have done. It may have sounded like some real querying and intrusive questions, but all trying to get to the same place. And I've been involved in these types of negotiations with some of the cities and towns I've worked with over the years, so I can appreciate what you all go through and how positions change and evolve over time. So anyway, let's leave it by consensus the commission that I will put together a draft letter, get it out to the commission. We'll review, revise, edit. Again, but not address to the commission as a whole, but any comments back to me, and we'll funnel it that way to avoid any open meetings issues. And then we'll have a special meeting of the commission next Thursday at 8, unless Madeline finds that there's some conflict with Annapolis TV. So that having been said, anything else for the good of the order? No, so entertain a motion to adjourn. Commission members, anybody want to adjourn? Okay, Ed made the motion, Bob seconded. Any discussion? Hearing none. Patrick, do you have discussion? No. Okay. All in favor of adjourning, wave your left hand. No, signify by saying aye. We'll adjourn.